Welcome to History to Snooze By, where each story arrives as a gentle letter carried on the softest whisper of time. Tonight, I invite you to find your most comfortable seat, to draw a quiet breath, and to let the cares of the day drift away as you listen. In the hours ahead, I will guide you through the causes and consequences of the Great War in a calm, flowing narrative designed to ease your mind and carry you into the past. If you enjoy this journey, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where in history you'd like to wander next. Your support helps us continue to share these soothing tales, and your thoughts inspire each new chapter. Now, sit back and relax. Allow the words to wash over you as we embark on our first letter, tracing the quiet Europe that stood on the edge of a storm. Yours ever in friendship, the historian of history to snooze by. Chapter 1. A Quiet Europe on the Edge. My dear friend, I hope that this letter finds you in gentle spirits and that the world outside your windows appears as serene as the scene before me now. I write from my study where the late spring light filters softly through lace curtains and dances upon my desk. The cadence of everyday life holds a comforting regularity. Trams pass in the distance, and the church bells mark each quarter hour. Shopkeepers curate their displays with fresh produce and shining wares. In nearby cafés, laughter drifts from open doorways, and the scent of roasted coffee beans lingers in the air. At first glance, all feels peaceful and ordered. Yet I sense a subtle tension under that calm surface, a quiet ripple of unease that seems impossible to ignore. In this chapter, I wish to capture how this gentle peace still bore the seeds of conflict. In the great capitals of Europe, life moves with a blend of tradition and innovation. In Paris, horse-drawn carriages share the streets with motor cars, and the scent of fresh bread drifts along wide boulevards. In London, double-decker omnibuses navigate crowded thoroughfares, while gentlemen and ladies in smart attire exchange polite greetings on the pavement. In Berlin, the factories hum a steady tune, and the grandeur of boulevards lined with statues speaks to a confident nation. Street vendors call out their wares, and children play by fountains as residents pause to read the morning newspapers. Newspapers report on the latest colonial appointments or debate the merits of political reforms, and citizens read them with earnest interest. Social clubs gather in elegant halls to celebrate music, poetry, and the pursuit of knowledge. Each day seems to build on the last in a rhythm as reassuring as a lullaby. And yet, even in the heart of this bustling life, I cannot shake a feeling that we stand on a quiet edge between what has been and what may soon be swept away by forces beyond our control. In the countryside, a different tempo rules the day. Farmers rise with the dawn to tend to fields of wheat and barley that ripple like golden oceans under the summer sun. Shepherds guide their flocks toward cool streams where sheep gather to drink, and the soft murmur of water soothes the mind. Village bakeries release the sweet scent of freshly baked loaves, and neighbors pause in doorways to exchange news of births, weddings, and the seasons. Children chase after chickens in dusty yards, and elderly folk rock in wooden chairs, gazing out over the gentle hills. Dark clouds on the horizon may promise rain or threaten storms, but most days end in calm light that seems to promise tomorrow will resemble today. Even here, however, I hear rumblings of political talks in distant towns, and sense that this quiet life, once taken for granted, may soon feel quite fragile. In cities and towns, a sense of optimism ripples through society. Advances in science promise to reshape our world with electrification, new medicines, and ever faster travel. Many believe that progress is inevitable and that human ingenuity will conquer even the greatest challenges. Railway lines stretch farther than ever before, bridging rivers and mountains and bringing distant lands into closer view. Telephones lend immediate voices to friends and family who once had to wait weeks for a letter. The excitement of invention pulses through workshops and academic halls alike as researchers probe the mysteries of electricity, radiation, and the human mind. Yet for all this hopeful spirit, there remain murmurs of unease at the speed of change and anxiety about what such sweeping advances might bring to the societies that embrace them. Artists and thinkers across Europe engage in lively exchanges that push boundaries and redefine beauty. In cafés and salons, painters discuss the bold strokes of modern art and musicians try compositions that challenge tradition. Writers craft stories that venture into the depths of human emotion, while philosophers consider what such explorations reveal about the soul. Science, too, seems to be making leaps each year that defy expectation. Marie Curie's discoveries in radioactivity spark both wonder and caution. The signals sent across wires and through the ether open possibilities of global communication. In these heady halls of creativity and inquiry, the future seems radiant with promise. Yet, just as some celebrate these new frontiers, others worry that the pace of transformation leaves little time to cherish the comforts of the familiar past. Factories churn forth goods that fill homes and armies alike. Iron and steel feed the furnaces of shipyards, rail workshops, and armaments manufacturers. Coal trains rumble through mountain passes loaded with the black stone that fuels this great engine of industry. Machines clatter and hiss in dimly lit halls as workers tend to rows of presses, looms, and riveters. Across the continent, these factories sustain livelihoods for millions and feed the ambitions of nations eager to expand their power and influence. At the same time, most of us enjoy items that once seemed miraculous, such as electric lights, running water, and printed books at modest cost. Still, I have heard voices cautioning that such abundance can breed complacency, especially when the tools of peace and progress can so easily be turned toward destructive ends. As factories grew, so too did the voices of workers seeking fair wages and safer conditions. In towns and cities, labor unions organized meetings and rallies, pressing for the 8-hour day and improved safety standards. Strikes in heavy industry could idle entire regions and spark clashes between workers and authorities. Trade union banners unfurled in the streets bore slogans calling for justice and dignity. Government officials sometimes responded with sympathy, while at other times they called in soldiers to protect the interests of factory owners. Meanwhile, intellectuals and social reformers debated the rights of labor and the responsibilities of capital. This struggle for better conditions introduced a new kind of tension into societies that seemed confident in their harmonious progress. Behind the grand facades of palaces and elegant townhouses lay stark inequalities that weighed heavily on many hearts. A slender elite amassed vast fortunes through trade, industry, and colonial ventures. Their lives were filled with fine dining, exclusive clubs, and private concerts. Below them in social order stood a growing middle class of professionals, merchants, and skilled craftsmen living modestly but with pride. Yet for millions of laborers and agricultural workers, life remained a daily struggle to secure food, shelter, and basic care. The gulf between these worlds felt wider with each passing year. Some in the elite worried that unchecked inequality might ignite revolts, while sympathetic nobles and reformers sought to bridge the divide. Others urged caution, fearing that too much change might unravel the social bonds that held nations together. Every European nation in 1914 carried its own political traditions that shaped daily life in distinct ways. Constitutional monarchies in Britain and Belgium balanced royal pomp with elected parliaments. In France, the Third Republic prized liberty, equality, and fraternity even as political scandals tested public faith. In Germany, the Kaiser's court combined imperial grandeur with the ambition of a rising power. Austria-Hungary held together a mosaic of peoples under the Habsburg crown, though tensions simmered among its many ethnic groups. Russia's Tsar commanded vast armies and bureaucracies while facing calls for reform. Each system had its champions and critics, and each seemed firm in its certainties. Yet behind these structures I hear the whispered question of how long they can resist pressures for change before they must adapt or break. As Europe's power grew, so too did the far-reaching webs of empire that spanned continents and oceans. In Africa, colonial governors competed to extend flags across territory and control resources. In Asia, trade posts evolved into protectorates and colonies under European rule. Missionaries and merchants traveled alongside soldiers to advance both faith and fortunes. Maps in schoolrooms bore the colored edges of Britain, France, Germany, and others that carved the globe like a chessboard. At home, debates raged over the costs and benefits of empire. Some celebrated these ventures as civilizing missions that brought railways, hospitals, and modern education to distant lands. Others decried the exploitation, forced labor, and conflicts that too often accompanied colonial rule. Even now, unseen struggles in the colonies foreshadowed tensions that might draw European armies across seas into unfamiliar wars. In many corners of Europe, a fervent sense of national identity began to pulse with renewed vigor. Newspapers published stories of historic glories, stirring pride in language, culture, and heritage. Public celebrations marked anniversaries of battles and the births of founding figures. Song and dance revived ancient traditions, while rallies and speeches urged citizens to unify under a common banner. Nationalist societies formed to protect languages and customs they feared might fade under foreign influence. Around dinner tables, families spoke of the duty to serve the nation, and young men dreamed of joining volunteer militias to defend the fatherland. Yet this rising pride could also divide neighbors who spoke different tongues or traced roots to different kingdoms. I sense that such fervor, once ignited, can blaze bright or burn ruinous. Across the Rhine, the memory of past wars with France still lingered in Germany, and in France the desire to recover lost provinces never died. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 left enduring scars that shaped politics and military plans on both sides. In France, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine that became part of Germany remained symbols of national longing. French politicians argued that strength at home required preparation to regain what had been lost. German leaders insisted on guarding their gains with strong armies and fortresses. At the border towns, civilians found themselves caught between two destinies, as families sometimes spoke both languages and loyalties divided. This unresolved rivalry awaited only the slightest spark to flare back into open hatred. In the vast expanse of the Russian Empire, the longing for influence in the Balkans shaped the Tsar's ambitions and alarmed other powers. Russian leaders saw themselves as guardians of Slavic peoples under Ottoman rule, pledging to protect their culture and faith. Newspapers in St. Petersburg praised the idea of a greater Balkan state under Russian guidance. Russian armies periodically maneuvered near their southwestern borders, and military advisors studied rail lines and river crossings for potential campaigns. At the same time, Russia faced its own unrest at home, as revolutionaries agitated for political change and workers endured harsh factory conditions. The Tsar's government believed that foreign victories might unite the nation, while critics warned that foreign adventurism might inflame unrest rather than heal it. To the southwest, Austria-Hungary held together a patchwork of nationalities under the Habsburg crown that seemed both splendid and precarious. From Vienna's grand palaces to small Bohemian villages, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, and others navigated a shared fate. Some looked to the court in Vienna for guidance and protection, while others nurtured dreams of independent nations. The dual monarchy's institutions tried to balance these demands, but its leaders moved slowly and uneasily. When minor crises arose, they reminded citizens that unity required tolerance and patience. Yet many believed that only force could hold this diverse empire together. In this land of majestic architecture and varied languages, the promise of harmony stood on the brink of fracturing. In the southeast, the Ottoman Empire, long called the sick man of Europe, struggled to maintain its hold over territories that once stretched from Central Europe to North Africa. In recent decades, it lost ground in the Balkans and North Africa as nationalist movements and foreign interventions chipped away at its lands. Syrian and Armenian communities under Ottoman rule lived amid shifting authority and occasional unrest. European powers stationed advisors to oversee reforms that often appeared half-hearted or resisted by local elites. Despite attempts at modernization, the empire faced deep financial troubles and fears that its weakening might spill chaos into the heart of Europe. For those living near its borders, the Ottoman decline seemed both a threat and an opportunity as old alliances shifted and new ones formed. As the political map of Europe grew more tangled, so too did the appetite for military strength. Parades of soldiers and public reviews stirred pride in national flags and uniforms. Generals published books praising the virtues of modern warfare and the discipline of well-trained troops. Young men flocked to volunteer militias to learn shooting and marching, eager to test themselves in defense of their homeland. The notion spread that war was an honorable path to settle disputes and that military success reflected a nation's character. Many believed that a powerful army offered security in an uncertain world. Yet beneath these celebrations of martial prowess lay a darker awareness that the machinery of war could in a moment unleash devastation of a scale unfathomable in past centuries. On the seas, another competition for power took shape in the form of great battleships. Britain, long mistress of the waves, responded to Germany's decision to build a modern navy by commissioning ships of unprecedented size and firepower. Dockyards from Belfast to Kiel rang with the hammers and sparks of innovation as steel leviathans took shape on the slips. Newspapers ran headlines listing each new vessel launched, and public opinion backed the belief that maritime strength guaranteed trade routes and national safety. Admirals lectured cities on the importance of dreadnoughts, while critics warned of the enormous cost and questionable value of building larger fleets. For the men who would one day serve aboard these ships, the race was a source of pride tinged with anxiety about the unknown tests that awaited them on unfamiliar oceans. Amid these growing preparations for conflict, nations sought security through formal commitments to one another. Treaties and agreements formed a network of alliances that promised mutual defense in times of danger. France and Russia pledged to support each other in response to threats from Germany or Austria-Hungary. Germany committed to stand by Austria-Hungary, confident that shared interest bound them together. Britain added its voice through understanding with France and later with Russia, creating a balance of power that aimed to deter aggression. Many treaties remained secret, known only to diplomats and military planners, while others were public and reassured citizens that their nation would never stand alone. Yet these alliances carried hidden risks, for they could turn a localized conflict into a wider war by drawing in multiple powers bound by obligation. In the years before the summer of 1914, several diplomatic crises tested these alliances and the resolve of Europe's leaders. In 1905 and again in 1911, Germany challenged France's control of Morocco, sending warships to Tangier and raising tensions across the continent. These Morocco crises led to intense negotiations in Paris and Berlin and revealed the brittle trust among even close allies. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, enraging Serbia and alarming Russia. That move forced Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser to engage in tense discussions to avert open conflict. Each crisis seemed to end with a gentlemanly agreement and promises to work together for stability. Yet I cannot help but feel that these settlements papered over deeper rifts, offering only a fragile calm before the storm. For many ordinary people, the sense of unease was a distant murmur rather than a clear warning. Mothers taught children their lessons and whispered prayers for health and safety. Fathers returned from work or fields and spoke of the latest political news at the dinner table, though they rarely predicted anything more dire than arguments in foreign courts. Shopkeepers closed their shutters at dusk with little concern for battles fought beyond the sea. Letters arrived from young men serving in colonial outposts or traveling abroad for business, recounting stories of exotic lands and kind smiles rather than threats of war. In neighborhoods, children laughed at street games and sense of dinner cooking drifted through open windows. Yet sometimes a neighbor spoke in hushed tones of a looming crisis, and I could see a flicker of worry in their eyes. As I close this first letter, I find myself torn between gratitude for the peace that still holds and anticipation of the challenges to come. Europe sits poised at a threshold where the familiar order of good mornings and shared laughter might give way to uncertainty and sorrow. In the next chapter, we will explore how the ideals of nationhood gave rise to proud movements that both inspired hope and inflamed conflict. We will trace the steps by which men and women embraced their heritage and yet came to expect that pride alone might be enough to shape the destiny of millions. Until then, I hope you carry with you the memory of these gentle days and the understanding that even a quiet harmony can conceal the hum of distant troubles. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 2: The Rise of National Pride. My dear friend, I write to you today with a heart full of reflection as I ponder how the gentle hum of everyday life gave way to a fervent voice calling out for unity and identity. In our last letter, we saw Europe poised on a quiet edge where undercurrents of change stirred beneath a veneer of peace. In this chapter, we will explore how the notion of nationhood blossomed into a rising tide of pride, one that bound people together in common purpose, yet also sowed the seeds of rivalry and suspicion. Across the continent, in grand salons and modest parish halls alike, men and women gathered to celebrate the bonds of language, history, and shared heritage. Newspapers carried stories of heroic deeds from ages past, and lively debates about what it meant to belong. In Paris, French patriots recalled the triumphs of the Revolution and the valor of soldiers who defended the nation's ideals. In Berlin, Germans traced their lineage to ancient tribes, marveling at the achievements of philosophers and poets who shaped the modern spirit. In Rome and Vienna, citizens cast their minds back to imperial glories, envisioning their nation's destiny in a changing world. These gatherings were seldom loud affairs. Rather, they depended on poems recited in hushed tones, songs sung with tender emotion, and banners unfurled with careful ceremony. In village squares, banners of blue, white, and red, or black, white, and red would wave gently above marketplaces on special occasions. Folk dances evoked traditional steps passed from one generation to the next. Elders recounted tales of local heroes who fought for freedom or defended the homeland against invaders in centuries past. In these moments, the bond between people and place felt almost sacred. Children watched with wide eyes as their elders carried flags and processions, their hearts stirred by the music of brass bands that played anthems meant to inspire loyalty. In towns of all sizes, festivals took on a new significance, becoming occasions to express pride in one's nation rather than simply marking the changing seasons. Universities across Europe became crucibles for this rising sentiment. Young scholars immersed themselves in histories that celebrated the achievements of their forebears. Professors lectured on the unique character of each people, examining literature, art, and folklore as expressions of national soul. Debates in lecture halls centered on the relationship between the state and its citizens on how best to cultivate loyalty without stifling individual freedoms. Student societies formed around shared language and culture, arranging concerts, theatrical performances, and public readings that reinforced a common identity. In Dresden and Krakow, in Edinburgh and Salamanca, the air buzzed with fresh ideas about self-determination and civic duty, ideas that reached far beyond city walls. Poets and writers added their voices to this chorus of national pride. In France, authors evoked the sight of fields of poppies beneath autumn skies as symbols of sacrifice and renewal. In Germany, verse celebrated the Rhine as a living artery that carried the spirit of the people through history. Italian novelists portrayed the struggles for unification as acts of noble devotion, while Slavic poets found inspiration in the haunting melodies of folk songs. These works spread through the press, reaching readers in towns and hamlets where literacy rates had steadily climbed. As bookshops flourished and printed pamphlets abounded, more citizens had access to stirring accounts of past glories and visions for the future. Yet, alongside these currents of unity, something more insistent took hold. The very pride that fostered solidarity also sharpened distinctions between us and them. When one nation celebrated its heroes, others bristled at any hint of superiority. Rivalries long suppressed by courtly courtesy found expression in newspaper editorials that questioned the strength or character of neighboring peoples. Cartoons depicted rival capitals in caricature, mocking their fashions or political leaders with biting humor. Social clubs once devoted to exchanging ideas on art and science now divided along national lines, each group convinced that its own culture held the key to progress. In everyday conversation, the talk turned to comparisons. Which language possessed the most elegant sounds? Which literature spoke deepest truths? Which armies stood as the finest in Europe? These questions seemed innocent enough on the surface, yet they carried weighty implications. To claim that one nation's virtues surpassed another's was to suggest a hierarchy that undermined the fragile balance of power. At the dinner table, over steaming bowls of soup or glasses of wine, friends debated such matters earnestly, their voices rising with zeal that surprised them as much as their listeners. The press played a powerful role in fanning these flames of pride and jealousy. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, publishing sensational headlines about political crises, diplomatic spats, or military parades. Front-page articles proclaimed the latest inventions as proof of national genius, while letters to the editor gave voice to both admiration and scorn for foreign rivals. In border regions, issues arrived bearing special supplements that gushed praise for local customs and railways, while cautioning against the ambitions of the neighbor across the river. Such content captivated readers accustomed only to local gossip, and it shaped public opinion in ways few had anticipated. Political leaders, attuned to the passions of their peoples, found that appeals to national pride could bolster support at home. Monarchs and ministers sponsored ceremonies that showcased cultural achievements, building museums, supporting composers, and commissioning grand monuments that celebrated national mythology. Public spectacles marked the anniversaries of historic victories or the births of founding figures. Ceremonial uniforms, elaborate flags, and stately processions lent pageantry to what might otherwise be dry commemorations of events centuries old. In the process, civic pride intertwined with political loyalty, making it difficult to criticize government policies without appearing unpatriotic. In some lands, a darker strain of nationalism emerged, where the concept of national identity blended with the notion of racial or cultural superiority. Groups sprouted that sought to define the nation by narrow criteria of ancestry or faith, excluding those who did not fit their vision. Pamphlets circulated calling for restrictions on immigration or for the suppression of minority languages. At times, local officials enacted policies that favored the dominant group, imposing schooling or language regulations that eroded the customs of smaller communities. These measures sparked protests and fed resentment among those whose voices grew fainter in the hum of public life. In the Balkans, the rise of national pride took on especially combustible force. Their overlapping claims to territory and identity set Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, and other groups on collision courses. Secret societies formed with the goal of liberating compatriots under foreign rule, inspiring daring raids and violent reprisals. Students in Belgrade secreted weapons for missions in Bosnia. In Sofia, activists sharpened their pens to denounce Ottoman rule. The sin of gunpowder mingled with the call of the muezzin in streets where Christian and Muslim communities sought to coexist. Every demonstration, every clash, every arrest added fuel to a fire that local leaders could neither contain nor fully comprehend. In Austria-Hungary, the weight of this ferment fell heavily on the Habsburg crown. Within its borders, Germans and Hungarians held privileged positions while Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and others felt marginalized. Newspapers in Prague bristled with editorials demanding greater autonomy. In Transylvania, petitions circulated for official recognition of the Romanian language. In Dalmatia, petitions called for schools in Croatian. The imperial government responded with a mixture of concessions and crackdowns, granting limited reforms one year and dispatching troops the next. For many citizens, these measures did little to assuage the sense that the state viewed them as subjects rather than partners. Even lawful politics absorbed the fervor of nationalism. Political parties based their platforms on the defense of national interests, whether through tariffs that protected domestic industries or through foreign policies intended to secure colonies and trade routes. Campaign speeches brimmed with references to national glory and the duty of citizens to stand firm. Voters received party newspapers touting the achievements of their champions and warning of the dangers of voting for rivals who might weaken the nation. In this atmosphere, compromise grew difficult, as any concession risked being branded betrayal. Yet for many proponents of national pride, the movement offered hope rather than fear. They believed that by forging a strong sense of identity, citizens could break free from old hierarchies and build modern societies responsive to their own needs. In newly unified Italy, education reforms sought to teach a standard language and instill civic virtues. In Germany, social welfare programs aimed to strengthen the bond between the state and its people, offering support that transcended class divisions. In France, the Third Republic promoted secular education to unify diverse regions under shared ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In these endeavors, citizens laid aside local loyalties in favor of a larger community that they hoped would bring progress and security. Across the ocean, these ideas of national self-determination found echo in the United States, where immigrants of various origins adapted to the notion of an American identity. Though debates over language and culture continued, the idea that a nation could be defined by shared principles rather than blood ties inspired movements for women's rights and labor reform. Though these developments lay beyond the borders of Europe, they contributed to the broader sense that nationalism held the promise of a more inclusive society. As the years passed before 1914, the rising tide of national pride reached its crest in many nations. Enthusiasm blossomed in parades and festivals. Monuments rose in city squares. School children recited patriotic verses every morning. Newspapers printed special editions for national holidays. Volunteers formed rifle clubs to train for defense of the homeland. Even in the humblest cottages, one might find a small flag displayed with reverence on chosen days. In each of these acts, the citizen took part in a grand ritual of belonging, confident that no power might overlook the bond between people and their nation. And yet, in the spirit that united strangers under one flag lay the potential for division and conflict. As each nation proclaimed its own excellence, it also stoked the anxieties of those who feared being left behind. Grand gestures of solidarity could mutter undertones of exclusivity. Festivities in one capital might draw skeptical glances from neighbors who worried that such displays masked ambitions of dominance. In the notion that a strong nation was the highest goal, some lost sight of the value of cooperation across borders. And in that moment, subtle rivalries became as real as any army on parade. As I fold this chapter and prepare to send my reflections on the rise of national pride across the miles to you, I carry with me the lessons of both hope and caution. Pride in one's heritage can be a source of strength that enriches community life. Yet when it becomes a contest of superiority, it can harden hearts and create walls where bridges might have stood. In our next letter, we will examine how these sentiments, once cultivated, intertwined with imperial ambitions to weave a tapestry of global rivalries that drew distant lands into Europe's orbit. Until then, may the sense of identity that connects us to our past also guide us gently toward a future of understanding. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 3: Imperial Ambitions and Colonial Rivalries. My dear friend, I hope this letter finds you well and at ease as we continue our journey through the years before the Great War. I write today of a horizon that stretched far beyond Europe's familiar streets and fields, where nations vied for distant lands and the promise of riches. In this chapter, we will explore how imperial ambitions and colonial rivalries wove a web of competition that reached into every corner of the globe and heightened the tensions that would one day engulf the world. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly every great power in Europe viewed an overseas empire as a mark of prestige and a source of strength. On maps hung in drawing rooms and government offices alike, colored borders spread across continents and islands. Britain claimed vast swaths of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. France held territories in West and North Africa as well as Indochina. Germany, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, and Spain all sought to carve out their own empires, however modest by comparison. Each year brought new negotiations, acquisitions, and sometimes clashes as these nations raced to secure ports, resources, and strategic outposts. In Africa, the rush for territory was most dramatic. Explorers, merchants, and soldiers penetrated forests, deserts, and rivers to plant flags and treaties. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 attempted to impose order on what came to be called the Scramble for Africa. Representatives from 14 European states met in an ornate palace in Berlin to draw lines on a map, agreeing on rules for annexation and trade. The conference did not include any African voices, and its decisions would reshape entire regions of the continent. By its end, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free of formal European control, and the borders drawn then would linger long after the colonial era ended. Britain and France emerged as the principal rivals in Africa. Their competition flared most visibly in the Sudan, where both powers sought control of the Nile Valley. In 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, British and Egyptian forces under General Kitchener defeated the Mahdist army, securing Britain's dominance in the region. A few years later, the Fishoda incident brought Britain and France to the brink of war when French troops advanced into southern Sudan only to find British soldiers already there. Tense days of negotiation followed, but the crisis was resolved peacefully when France withdrew its claim. Despite this peaceful outcome, the incident left lasting distrust and underlined how colonial rivalries could ignite serious conflict. Meanwhile, in southern Africa, the discovery of gold and diamonds in the Boer republics drew British ambitions to a head. The Boer Wars at the turn of the century pitted the British Empire against Dutch, descended settlers who sought to preserve their independence in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The first conflict in 1880 ended in Boer victories, but the second in 1899 lasted 2 brutal years. British forces laid siege to towns, and Boers waged guerrilla warfare from farmsteads and hills. Civilians suffered in internment camps. Though Britain ultimately prevailed and annexed the Boer territories, the war deeply scarred the empire's international reputation and fueled resentment among both Afrikaners and critics at home. Italy and Germany sought empires of their own, though with more limited success. Italy's campaigns in Libya in 1911 and 1912 wrested Tripolitania and Cyrenaica from the weakening Ottoman Empire, but at great cost in lives and treasure. Germany, arriving late to the colonial race, held territories in what are now Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, and the Pacific. Its administration often clashed with local peoples, and uprisings such as the Maji-Maji Rebellion of 1905 to 1907 in East Africa were met with ruthless suppression. Though not as vast as British or French holdings, these German colonies became symbols of national pride and subjects of bitter debate in Berlin. In Asia, European powers had long maintained footholds, but their ambitions continued to grow. Britain ruled India with an iron grip, supported by an army of Indian soldiers under British officers. The Raj united a vast subcontinent, but undercurrents of dissent and nationalist sentiment began to stir among local elites and reformers. France, with its protectorates in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, extended railways and plantations, transforming the region's economy and society. Russia pressed southward into Manchuria, while Germany briefly held concessions in China. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 signaled a shift, as an Asian power demonstrated it could match European armies and claim territories of its own. Beyond trade and politics, missionaries and traders often preceded soldiers, bringing religion, goods, and new ideas to distant lands. Mission stations established schools and clinics, sometimes protecting local populations from more exploitative forces, but also eroding traditional beliefs. Trading companies built trading posts and factories, exchanging cloth, guns, and rum for ivory, rubber, and palm oil. Where these enterprises met resistance, they called for military protection. In other places, they negotiated treaties with local chiefs, offering modern conveniences in exchange for land rights. The line between commerce, culture, and conquest blurred as economic motives intertwined with moral and religious rationale. Economic interests lay at the heart of imperial expansion. Coal, rubber, timber, minerals, and cash crops from colonies fueled the factories and kitchens of Europe. Investors financed railways and mines, expecting handsome dividends. Governments levied taxes on colonial subjects and secured favorable trade treaties, yet profits were never guaranteed. Plantations failed, rebellions interrupted rail links, and the cost of policing vast territories drained treasuries. Debates in Parliament and the Reichstag weighed the benefits of colonies against their expense, but politicians often concluded that empire was as much about national honor as about balance sheets. Colonial rivalries sometimes spilled back into Europe in the form of diplomatic crises. The Morocco crises of 1905 and 1911 tested relations between Germany and France when Kaiser Wilhelm declared support for Moroccan independence, challenging French influence. French and German warships hovered off the Moroccan coast as negotiations teetered on the brink of failure. Ultimately, France conceded territory in Central Africa to Germany in exchange for recognition of its Moroccan protectorate. Though war was averted, each side emerged convinced of the other's hostility. The consequence of these imperial contests was a network of mutual suspicion woven through diplomatic circles and military staffs. Foreign ministries kept meticulous files on rivals' colonial forces, estimating the number of troops available overseas and the time required to transport them home. General staffs plotted maps showing how quickly convoys could move from India or Africa to European ports, should war demand their recall. Colonial officers and diplomats met at conferences in Europe, exchanging guarded pleasantries while probing for weaknesses. Behind closed doors, they wondered whether a distant colony might serve as a bargaining chip or a battlefield in the event of conflict. For the peoples under colonial rule, the experience was mixed. Some benefited from improved infrastructure such as roads, railways, and hospitals. Others suffered forced labor, land seizures, and cultural suppression. In West Africa, communities uprooted by railway construction grumbled as their fields gave way to steel tracks. In India, British laws altered land tenure and revenue systems, creating debt peonage among smallholders. In Southeast Asia, rubber plantations demanded long hours of backbreaking work. Yet in each case, colonial rule also introduced new educational opportunities and legal frameworks. A small but growing number of colonized elites learned European languages, studied in colonial universities, and began to question the logic of foreign domination. These colonial experiences would leave deep marks on both colonizers and colonized. Troops recruited from India and Africa stood alongside European soldiers in wars to come, forging bonds of experience even as inequalities persisted. Colonial administrators applied lessons learned in one territory to others, refining methods of control that would shape rebellions and reforms. Missionaries carried back stories of distant lands that fascinated readers in Europe, fueling further interest and investment. Trade goods tasted new flavors in European markets, while fashion borrowed silks and spices from the East. As the sun set on this era of empire, the tangled legacies of conquest and rivalry became ever more pronounced. The competition for colonies heightened national pride, even as it deepened mistrust among great powers. Agreements made in drawing rooms and conference halls sought to manage these rivalries, but often papered over deeper resentments. The colonies themselves became sources of manpower for armies and navies, meaning that any European war would instantly become global in scale. The tools of empire, railways, steamships, telegraphs, would accelerate the mobilization of men and material once conflict began. In our next letter, we will turn our attention to the great buildup of armies and navies that accompanied these imperial ventures. We will examine how the belief in military power as the ultimate guarantor of security took hold across Europe and set the stage for a confrontation that no nation could truly win without the others. Until then, I hope you reflect on how distant lands and the quest for prestige so profoundly shaped the world we knew and the peace we took for granted. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 4: Militarism and the Arms Race. My dear friend, in our last letter, we traced how imperial ambitions extended Europe's rivalries across distant continents. Today, I wish to explore the forces that bound those rivalries to the drumbeat of armies and navies. We will see how nations embraced the notion that strength lay in steel and discipline, and how the steady hum of industry transformed into an unrelenting march of armaments. In each capital, in every dockyard and drill ground, a belief took hold that military might was the surest path to security. Yet in that conviction lay the seeds of miscalculation and the tragic certainty that once war came, no nation could emerge unscathed. Across Europe, military tradition enjoyed a revival that touched every stratum of society. Kings and presidents inspected rows of polished rifles and marched alongside soldiers in resplendent uniforms. Parliamentarians praised the virtues of discipline and sacrifice. In cafés and town squares, citizens discussed the latest recruitments with a mixture of pride and solemn duty. The image of the citizen soldier became revered as a guardian of the homeland, and young men answered the call to serve with eagerness. In some lands, conscription was long established, a rite of passage marking the transition from boyhood to manhood. In others, compulsory service had been introduced only recently but took on great symbolic weight, as if participation in the nation's defense bound every citizen in a sacred pact. Not only did armies expand, but navies too captured the popular imagination. Britain, mistress of the waves for generations, felt pressure from a rising German fleet that challenged its command of the oceans. In shipyards from Belfast to Hamburg, great battleships took shape under the sparks of riveters' torches. These dreadnoughts, named for Britain's revolutionary HMS Dreadnought of 1906, embodied the belief that larger guns and thicker armor would guarantee victory in any future conflict. The race to build ever more potent vessels became a point of national pride. Crowds gathered at launching ceremonies, children waved miniature flags, and newspapers printed photographs of the latest floating fortresses with rapt attention. On land, the buildup was no less dramatic. France maintained one of the largest standing armies in Europe and introduced universal conscription in the years after the Franco-Prussian War. Germans responded in kind, expanding their reserve forces and refining the process by which citizens transferred from civilian life to military service. In Russia, the Tsar's army swelled with recruits from every province, though its officers complained of inadequate training and supply. Austria-Hungary balanced the demands of its diverse peoples by rotating its regiments through border garrisons and major cities to foster loyalty. In each state, the general staffs meticulously calculated the number of men, horses, and trains required for mobilization. The planning was astonishing in its precision. Military theorists drafted schedules showing how quickly infantry divisions could entrain at rural stations, stream across provinces, and concentrate at frontiers. Railways became weapons in themselves, their timetables inseparable from the logic of war. Officers rehearsed hypothetical invasions, mapping out routes and transfer points for artillery and supply columns. In Germany, the Schlieffen Plan envisioned a swift sweep through neutral Belgium to encircle Paris before turning east against Russia. In France, Plan 17 prepared for an invasion of Alsace-Lorraine to recapture lost provinces and strike decisively at the German heartland. Each blueprint carried with it assumptions about speed, surprise, and the willingness of soldiers to press on even as machine guns and shells tore open the ground before them. Armaments factories thrived on this perceived necessity. Industrialists invested in new steelworks and munitions plants. Engineers experimented with rapid-fire guns and smokeless powder. Artillery pieces grew ever larger, with calibers measured in inches rather than centimeters. Inventors touted machine guns that could lay down withering fire on advancing columns. Inventors in Germany claimed to have perfected shells that shattered on impact, releasing lethal fragments. Chemical factories explored agents that could disable troops without destroying infrastructure. Across Europe, the call for innovation became urgent, with military attaches dispatched to observe tests and share intelligence among allied powers. The press, for its part, fanned both enthusiasm and apprehension. Newspaper articles boasted of Country X's latest breakthrough in field artillery, while cartoonists lampooned rival generals for failing to keep pace. Editorials urged citizens to support increased defense spending, warning that any hesitation would invite aggression. Some voices cautioned that the very scale of the buildup risked making conflict inevitable. Yet such warnings were often drowned out by heartfelt pledges of solidarity with the troops and stirring appeals to national pride. Fundraising committees sold war bonds to finance battleships, and women's associations knitted socks and scarves for infantrymen headed to maneuvers. Public military reviews became spectacles that brought civilians close to the glories of the barracks. On designated holidays, tens of thousands gathered to watch cavalry squadrons execute intricate drills and infantry regiments fire volleys in unison. Music from brass bands filled the air as officers rode along the ranks, inspecting each man's equipment. Photographers captured the intensity of eyes fixed forward, and postcards of these scenes circulated widely, reinforcing the image of an indomitable martial spirit. For many, these displays confirmed that their nation could count on a disciplined and motivated army should crisis erupt. Yet beneath the pomp lay tensions of supply and morale. Officers lamented shortages of trained NCOs and the difficulty of sustaining lengthy field exercises. Horses, vital for transport and cavalry, fell ill from overwork and inadequate forage. Ammunition stocks sometimes ran low during extended drills, leading to hurried orders that stretched factories to the limit. Soldiers accustomed to parades and camps found the prospect of modern warfare daunting. Some officers privately acknowledged that no amount of preparation could simulate the reality of shell-scarred fields and barbed wire. The technological leap of the era added further complexity. High-velocity artillery guns could batter forts once considered impregnable. Machine guns rendered mass charges suicidal. Observers from tethered balloons or early airplanes directed fire with unprecedented accuracy. Telegraph lines allowed immediate reports from the front to reach high command. Even automobiles served as ambulances or dispatch vehicles. The vocabulary of war expanded to include flank, enfilade, and artillery barrage, terms once confined to academic treatises. In workshops, mathematicians calculated trajectories, while chemists refined explosives. The very instruments of destruction became prized symbols of national ingenuity. All this progress fed a dangerous optimism about the nature of future wars. Many believed that a well-planned, short war would settle disputes swiftly and spare nations the prolonged agony of earlier centuries. They pictured decisive victories within weeks, if not days, after which soldiers would return to cheering crowds and rebuilt homes. Generals spoke of battles lasting but a morning, with limited loss and quick peace treaties. Citizens embraced this notion, confident that modern science had rendered war more humane even as it made it deadlier. Such faith proved tragically misplaced when war did come. Politically, militarism reshaped governance in subtle ways. Defense ministers and general staffs gained unprecedented influence in budgetary debates. Parliaments often deferred to military experts on issues ranging from railway expansion to medical care. In some states, the line blurred between civilian and military authority, as staffs issued directives that carried the urgency of law. Diplomatic channels included military representatives who could veto or press forward any negotiation affecting strategic interests. Cabinet meetings sometimes opened with briefings on troop strength rather than economic reports. In this atmosphere, civilian leaders felt both the burden and the reassurance of wielding military power. At the same time, alliances took on new character shaped by shared plans for mobilization and joint defense. When one power increased its army, its ally found it prudent to follow. Secret agreements extended to coordinating railway timetables and standardizing munitions calibers. Officers from allied nations held joint exercises to practice combined operations. The sense of mutual obligation deepened, as each believed the other would stand firm when the moment of crisis arrived. Yet such bonds carried the risk that a conflict involving one member would instantly draw in the rest, turning what might have been a localized skirmish into a continental conflagration. In towns and villages, the arrival of conscripts in town squares evoked pride tempered by worry. Families saw sons and brothers march away in crisp uniforms, faces set with resolve. Parades past war memorials reminded spectators of past sacrifices. Local newspapers printed their names and offered wistful messages of good luck. Yet at night, mothers worried over the scarceness of letters and fathers listened for news of accidents and training. Economies in rural districts felt the absence of able-bodied men, and women learned new tasks to keep farms running. In this intimate way, militarism reached into every household. By 1914, the combined effect of these trends was undeniable. Europe stood armed to the teeth, a vast assembly of armies and navies primed for action. Generals had memorized timetables for deployment, and politicians assured their people that such measures were purely defensive. Citizens accepted that spending on battleships, Guns and ammunition was as vital as schools and hospitals. The machinery of war had become as normal as the machinery of peace. And yet beneath that normalcy lay a dire truth. When those machines started in earnest, they would tear apart the fabric of the world we knew. As I close this letter, I feel the weight of what we have built. Not skyscrapers of steel, nor bridges spanning rivers, but fortresses of steel intent on holding each other at bay. In our next letter, we will delve into the web of alliances that bound these military powers together and examine how those bonds meant to deter aggression ultimately set the stage for a conflict that swept all before it. Until then, may we remember that every cannon forged is a reminder of our shared responsibility to seek peace, even as we prepare for the worst. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 5. The Web of Alliances. My dear friend, I hope these words find you in sound health and tranquil spirit. As we have traced the tides of nationalism in the race for colonies and armaments, we turn now to the bonds that tied Europe's nations together and bound them to one another in ways both reassuring and perilous. In this chapter, we will explore how treaties and understandings formed a web of alliances that ultimately turned local disputes into a continent-wide conflagration. We will see how hopes for collective security gave way to a fearful dependence on secret pacts and rigid commitments. In the years following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, French leaders sought reassurance against the memory of defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. They found it in the alliance with Russia. In 1892, a secret military agreement pledged mutual support should either nation be attacked by Germany or Austria-Hungary. Publicly, the arrangement promised only friendly cooperation. Privately, it bound two great powers to come to each other's aid in times of danger. French generals and Russian staff officers began planning joint exercises in the event of mobilization. Rail timetables were adjusted to allow Russian divisions to pass through German-controlled territory of neutral states if war broke out. For the first time since Napoleon, France looked eastward for protection rather than westward. Meanwhile, Germany, seeking to secure its own position, strengthened ties with its old ally, Austria-Hungary. The dual monarchy had stood with Prussia during the wars of German unification and provided soldiers and resources in return. In 1879, a formal treaty reinforced the promise of mutual defense should Russia threaten either power. This dual alliance created a central bloc of support in Central Europe. German leaders believed that a tightly bound partnership with Austria-Hungary would deter Russian aggression and assure their southern frontier. The Austro-Hungarian court, in turn, welcomed German support for its own struggles with Slav nationalism in the Balkans. Britain, long accustomed to splendid isolation, watched these developments with growing unease. The Royal Navy remained supreme, but many in London feared that Germany's naval expansion threatened Britain's command of the seas. Equally troubling was the prospect of a German-Russian entente that might leave Britain out in the cold. As tensions rose over colonial disputes and the naval race, British policymakers sought closer ties with France. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 resolved long-standing disagreements over territories in Africa and Asia, bringing a new measure of goodwill between two former rivals. Though strictly a colonial understanding at first, it paved the way for deeper cooperation in years to come. Just a few years later, in 1907, Britain and Russia concluded their own agreement. The Anglo-Russian Convention settled conflicting interests in Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet, drawing boundaries and spheres of influence that reduced friction in Central Asia. With France, Britain had already established the Entente Cordiale. With Russia, it now forged a practical settlement. These two accords seen together created the Triple Entente. In theory, it was no more than a spirit of cooperation and consultation. In practice, military planners in each capital began to consider how they might support one another if war erupted on the continent. Thus, by 1914, two opposing blocs faced each other. On one side stood Germany and Austria-Hungary, bound by their dual alliance and bolstered by their growing naval collaboration. On the other side stood France, Russia, and Britain, linked by the Franco-Russian alliance and the Twin Ententes. Italy hovered uneasily, tied by treaty to Germany and Austria-Hungary but resentful of Austrian control over Italian-speaking lands. Japan held an alliance with Britain in the east, but its interests lay far from European concerns. Each major power believed, some more publicly than others, that its alliance would deter aggression and ensure peace. Yet the very existence of these webs of obligation meant that any conflict, however limited in scope, might draw many nations into its vortex. Secret diplomacy added another layer of complexity. Beyond the published treaties lay informal understandings and whispered promises exchanged by envoys behind closed doors. Officials met in embassy drawing rooms late at night, swapping assurances that one day might prove decisive. Germany gave Austria-Hungary a blank check of support in any action it chose to take against Serbia. Britain hinted to France that in the event of German aggression, it would intervene on the side of the French. Russia assured Serbia of its backing in the Balkans, interpreting the Franco-Russian alliance as a green light for support of Slavic brethren. These secret commitments created expectations that could not easily be retracted once words had passed between heads of state. In military circles, the alliances shaped strategic planning in profound ways. German staff officers studied maps of France with the knowledge that if they struck swiftly in the west, they could count on Austrian pressure against Russia in the east. Russian generals assumed that hours after Austrian troops crossed the Danube, French armies would launch offensives into Alsace. British admirals reviewed fleet orders that anticipated cooperation with French squadrons in the North Sea. French commanders learned of British plans to dispatch expeditionary forces across the Channel if British Parliament approved mobilization. These plans, though often theoretical, took on life as governments issued orders from the highest offices. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 provided an early test of these alliances. In the first conflict, Balkan states united to expel the Ottoman Empire from most of its European possessions. Russia offered diplomatic support, while Austria-Hungary feared the emergence of a powerful Serbian state on its borders. When the Second War broke out as former allies turned on each other, Germany pressed Austria-Hungary to act decisively to protect its own interests. Though the conflicts did not directly involve France or Britain, the rivalries they exposed heightened fears across Europe. Each alliance partner reported on the actions of the others, and newspapers speculated on whether the Triple Entente or the Dual Alliance would respond to any call for help. In every capital, ministers feared being drawn into an unwanted war, yet felt compelled to stand by their pledges. Public opinion, stoked by patriotic press, often demanded strong action to honor national commitments. Governments struggled to reassure citizens that alliances were purely defensive while secretly preparing for contingencies. Diplomatic correspondence passed between foreign ministries with increasing urgency. Officials debated whether a dispute over a small corner of territory or an insult at a royal court might provoke obligations that could not be set aside without shattering a nation's credibility. By the eve of the summer of 1914, these alliances had become something like a trap. Their authors believed they would guarantee peace by presenting a united front against aggression. Yet the very certainty they offered bred a reliance on rapid mobilization and preemptive action. Military timetables assumed that once one alliance member moved its forces, others must follow or leave their partner exposed. Political leaders feared that if they hesitated to fulfill their promises, they would lose allies forever. In this climate, the machinery of alliances turned on itself like gears in a clock, threatening to drive nations inexorably toward conflict. In the lives of ordinary people, the alliance system felt distant yet real. Newspapers printed maps showing the lines between friend and foe. Citizens read editorials predicting that if Germany attacked Belgium, Britain would cross the Channel to save Paris. Schoolbooks contained patriotic verses celebrating the strength of allied nations. In port cities, dock workers watched French transports unload munitions destined for Russia. Preachers in small churches prayed for wisdom for leaders and for the safety of brothers serving in foreign armies. In towns and villages, rumors flew that conscription rolls might soon call lads away from farm and workshop. Even commerce felt the weight of these bonds. Merchants worried that a crisis could close markets or interrupt trade routes. Ship owners hesitated before sending vessels into contested waters. Financial markets trembled at news of diplomatic impasses, and investors questioned whether loans to allied governments would be repaid if war broke out. Economic ties that once promised mutual growth now carried an undercurrent of fear. Business leaders in London, Paris, and Berlin discussed how to protect assets if hostilities erupted, drawing up contingency plans for relocation and insurance claims. Yet for all its complexity and peril, the alliance system had its advocates. They argued that no nation would dare attack a member of a powerful coalition. They pointed to past conflicts that had been resolved peacefully because each side knew that allies would intervene. They held up the alliances as a modern guarantor of order, replacing the shifting balances of dynastic marriages and personal rivalries. To them, binding treaties among constitutional governments offered more stability than ad hoc arrangements. In the salons of capital cities, they toasted the dream of collective security, free from the whims of any single ruler. And so, as we approach the fateful days of June and July 1914, Europe stands arrayed in two great camps. Each power believes its bonds will protect it. Each hopes that diplomacy will prevail. Yet the hidden depth of obligations means that no crisis can be contained without risking the honor of a nation. In our next letter, we will examine how, on a quiet summer's day in Sarajevo, a single act would set these alliances in motion and plunge the world into the greatest war it had ever known. Until then, I remain grateful for your companionship on this journey and hopeful that understanding the past may guide us toward a more peaceful future. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 6. The Spark in Sarajevo. My dear friend, I write to you today with a sense of solemn reflection as I recall the events of a summer morning in Sarajevo that would ignite the tinder of Europe's tensions. On June 28, 1914, the grand avenues of this provincial city bore witness to an act so small in scale, yet so vast in consequence, that it would shatter the fragile peace we have surveyed in our earlier letters. In this chapter, I wish to walk you through the hour-by-hour unfolding of that day and the swift cascade of diplomatic responses that followed, tracing how a single moment of violence resonated through palaces and parliaments across the continent. Sarajevo at that time was a place of layered identities. Under Austro-Hungarian rule, its streets teemed with Bosnian Muslims, Orthodox and Catholic Christians, and a growing number of Serb nationalists. Markets overflowed with fruits and spices. Minarets rose alongside church steeples, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the rustle of newspapers proclaiming headlines in multiple languages. Tensions ran beneath this vibrant tapestry. Local newspapers editorialized on the rights of Slavic peoples to greater autonomy. Secret organizations met in quiet back rooms. Among these was the so-called Black Hand, a secret society committed to the cause of a unified South Slav state free from Habsburg authority. Into this charged atmosphere came Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife, Duchess Sophie, on a visit intended to review imperial troops and foster goodwill among the local populace. As the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke traveled with a large entourage, heralded by trumpets and escorted by cavalry. Villagers and city folk lined the boulevards, waving small flags and craning to glimpse the gleaming motorcar that bore the imperial couple. The sun shone warmly on the red and gold banners that fluttered in the gentle breeze, lending an air of celebration to the occasion. The motorcade moved slowly through the streets of the city, officers saluting from mounted steeds and soldiers standing at attention along the sidewalks. Children held out bouquets of summer flowers. Shopkeepers doffed their hats. In that moment, the promise of a ceremonial display seemed to outweigh any hint of discord. Yet in the crowd stood 6 young men armed with hidden revolvers and grenades, each poised to strike at the symbol of imperial power they so resented. The first attack came around 10:30 in the morning near the Latin Bridge. As the Archduke's car passed, a primed grenade sailed toward the open window of his vehicle. The driver caught sight of the missile and swerved, causing it to bounce off the folded-over convertible top and roll harmlessly under the wheels of the trailing car. In an instant, soldiers converged on the would-be assassin, who swallowed a capsule of poison and attempted to kill himself. The poison failed, and a blow from a soldier's rifle but rendered him unconscious. Amid the commotion, the Archduke remained composed, offering reassurances to onlookers that he was unharmed. He insisted on continuing with the day's program, determined not to be cowed by violence. The motorcade pressed onto the city hall, where the Archduke attended a luncheon and reviewed the injured officer at the local hospital. Sophie accompanied him with calm dignity, her presence a testament to their shared resolve. After the luncheon, the imperial party decided to visit the hospital on the opposite side of the river. The driver, unfamiliar with the city's winding streets and relying on maps, followed the original route rather than the revised path. As they turned at the corner of Princeps Café, the assassin, freed by his captor's neglect, found himself face to face with the Archduke's car at barely a few paces distance. In that moment of chance, he drew his pistol. 2 shots rang out. The first struck the Archduke in the jugular, the second wounded Duchess Sophie in the abdomen. The crowd reeled in horror. Ministers and officers leaped forward to shield the victims. The assassin dropped his weapon, proclaiming that a new Slavic state would rise from Habsburg oppression. The car raced to the hospital in panic, doctors attempting first aid as soldiers barred the doors and whispered prayers for the fallen. By noon, the news had spread beyond Sarajevo. Telegram stations crackled with urgent dispatches to Vienna, Belgrade, and capitals across Europe. In the imperial capital, the Archduke's condition was announced as critical. Crowds gathered outside newspapers' offices, reading bulletins with shock and disbelief. Social clubs suspended meetings. In church steeples, church bells told an uncertain refrain, as if echoing the tremor of foreboding that rippled through society. The imperial government in Vienna reacted with swift resolve. Emperor Franz Joseph, long accustomed to the theater of courtly ceremony, summoned his ministers and generals with unprecedented urgency. The foreign minister drafted a sharp protest note to Belgrade, accusing the Serbian government of complicity with the assassins. Army units along the border with Serbia were ordered to heighten readiness. A stern ultimatum took shape, demanding Serbian cooperation in suppressing treasonous elements or facing unspecified consequences. Germany, bound by the dual alliance and committed to Austria-Hungary's security, extended what came to be known as the blank check. Emperor Wilhelm II sent a telegram of full support, assuring his cousin in Vienna that Germany would stand by Austria in whatever measures were deemed necessary. In Berlin's ornate ambassadorial offices, German diplomats assured that Austria's response could count on unwavering backing. This assurance emboldened Vienna to press its demands without fear of diplomatic isolation. On July 23, Austria delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, laying out 10 precise conditions. Among them was the demand that Serbian officials suppress anti-Austrian propaganda and allow Austro-Hungarian investigators into Serbian territory to conduct inquiries. The tone left little room for negotiation. Serbia, mindful of the risks yet determined to preserve its sovereignty, replied with a carefully worded acceptance of most demands while reserving the right to consult its own legal processes on matters of jurisdiction. The reply arrived on the 25th of July. Austria found the Serbian response insufficient. On July 28, the imperial government severed diplomatic relations and declared war. Mobilization orders spread rapidly. In Belgrade, families hugged tearful farewells as reservists reported for muster. Crowds gathered before newspaper kiosks to read the declarations. The gloom of war overshadowed the expected celebrations of late July holidays. Serbia called upon Russia to uphold the bonds of Slavic kinship and pledged to resist any aggression. In St. Petersburg, the Caesar's advisors debated the grim prospect of conflict with Austria-Hungary and Germany. On the 29th, Russia ordered partial mobilization. Within hours, Germany, interpreting the move as a direct challenge, requested that Russia stand down its forces. When the request went unheeded, Germany declared full mobilization against Russia on August 1st. The drums of war sounded in barracks from Warsaw to Munich. Urals bristled with battalions destined for front lines well prepared by years of planning. Britain, observing these rapid escalations, held its own council of ministers. The question of intervention hinged on whether German troops violated Belgian neutrality guaranteed by treaty. When Germany's General Staff approved the invasion plan through Belgium as part of its strategy against France, Britain declared war on Germany on August. Public opinion, once divided, rallied around the notion of upholding international law even as young men queued at recruiting stations. In this way, the spark that fell in Sarajevo leapt across the continent, igniting alliances and mobilizations that left little hope for a peaceful settlement. A localized dispute became a full-scale war within days, as each power honored its commitments and responded to perceived threats. The outbreak of hostilities delivered the first hurts of artillery fire and the opening salvos of modern mechanized warfare. The elegant facades of European cities would soon bear the scars of conflict. As I fold this letter and consider the gravity of that summer morning, I am struck by the interplay of chance and design. A wrong turn by a driver, a man driven by zeal, words exchanged in hurried embassies. Each small decision converged to shatter a continent's calm. In our next letter, I will describe the first blows on the Western and Eastern fronts, and how armies once primed for parades found themselves entangled in the brutal realities of industrial warfare. Until then, may we hold fast to the belief that understanding the chain of events that led to conflict is the first step toward preventing its repetition. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 7. Mobilization and the Slide into War. My dear friend, I hope this letter finds you well and in peaceful spirits. In our last correspondence, we witnessed the assassination in Sarajevo and the rapid cascade of diplomatic ultimatums and declarations. Today, I wish to describe how the machinery of war, once set in motion, carried Europe inexorably toward a full-scale conflict. We will trace how plans drafted in quiet rooms, timetables etched on railway maps, and decisions made under the shadow of honor combined to turn tension into tragedy. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on that late July day, few believed the conflict could spread beyond the Balkans. Yet the alliance system, which we examined previously, meant that each act of mobilization reverberated through foreign ministries and stokerooms alike. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas II faced a grave choice: to stand by his Slavic brethren in Serbia or to yield to German pressure on behalf of Austria-Hungary. The St. Peter's ministers argued that backing Serbia was a matter of national honor and a fulfillment of treaty obligations with France. Recording this choice, the Tsar ordered a partial mobilization on July 29th, calling up select corps nearest the frontiers. In Berlin, German military leaders watched Russia's movements with mounting alarm. The General Staff interpreted any Russian mobilization as preparation for invasion. They believed that speed would be decisive. If Germany struck first against France and knocked it out of the war swiftly, then it could turn to meet Russia in the east. Such calculations rested on the famed Schlieffen Plan, conceived decades earlier, which envisioned an enveloping sweep through Belgium into northern France. On July 31st, Germany demanded that Russia suspend its mobilization. When no reply arrived, Germany declared war on Russia in the early hours of August. Germany's declaration inevitably drew in France. Bound by the Franco-Russian alliance, the French government could not stand aside as Russia faced the might of the Central Powers. French Prime Minister René Viviani convened his cabinet. With solemn resolve, they embraced mobilization, even as many citizens hoped that diplomacy might yet prevail. Parisian cafés fell silent when telegraphs flashed the news. Factory whistles blew to mark the call-up. Young men gathered at recruiting offices, signing their names in shaky script as their families looked on with equal measures of pride and dread. In London, a more complex debate unfolded. Britain had no formal obligation to enter a continental war, yet it felt compelled to defend Belgium's neutrality under the 1839 treaty. When Berlin announced plans to march through Belgian territory on August 2nd, British statesmen pressed Prime Minister Asquith to act. After anguished discussions, the cabinet agreed that violation of Belgian soil was a red line. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. London streets filled with cheering crowds and rumbling troop trains bound for the front. In every port city, the Royal Navy went to full readiness, sealing off the North Sea against German vessels. Thus, within a week, Europe's great powers had transformed from skeptical neighbors into belligerent foes. The slide into war felt inexorable as one mobilization followed another. Railway schedules, once designed for commerce and leisure, became blueprints for warfare. Stations pulsed with activity as soldiers in starched uniforms boarded crowded carriages. Each train carried not just men but artillery pieces, ammunition wagons, and horse fodder. Telegraph offices hummed with coded messages directing units to assembly points. In small towns, church bells rang out to mark the departure of local regiments, and children waved hand-stitched flags as columns marched past. For the common soldier, the experience was bewildering. One day he carried a rifle into the countryside for drills. The next, he found himself beside tracks under moonlight, rattling toward a destiny he scarcely comprehended. Officers handed out rations of hardtack and salted meat and urged their men to hold fast in the shock that lay ahead. Some veterans of earlier colonial campaigns shared words of encouragement, though few could forestall the deep anxiety that gripped each heart. Letters sent home spoke of excitement mingled with fear, as young soldiers penned brief notes to loved ones before moving on. The civilian population, too, felt the weight of this mobilization. In factories, workers labored around the clock to produce shells and rifles. Women stepped into roles once reserved for men, driving ambulances, working in munitions plants, and tending to patients in newly erected hospitals. Local councils organized relief committees to support families of soldiers, distributing parcels of food and clothing. Rationing boards met to plan the fair distribution of staples. The press, once brimming with political polemic, now published stirring dispatches from the front and notices of casualty lists that reached every community, no matter how remote. Even in neutral countries, the tremors of war were felt. Postal services slowed as lines were cut. Merchant ships in the Atlantic changed course to avoid blockades. Stock markets jittered with news of battles, and threatened Italian and Austro-Hungarian troops patrolled their common border. Public opinion in nations like Switzerland and the Netherlands tilted towards sympathy for neighbors, yet their leaders pursued strict measures to preserve neutrality, closing frontiers and monitoring foreign agents at every border post. Back in the capitals, generals and admirals convened their staffs to refine operational plans. Maps covered walls, dotted with colored pins marking divisions and fleets. Weather forecasts became as critical as troop movements. Rain could turn roads to mud, stalling supply columns, while fog could cloak advances or hinder aerial reconnaissance. Telegraph lines crackled with messages from frontline officers requesting reinforcements or medical supplies. In London's Admiralty, orders went out for blockades and the deployment of dreadnoughts. In Berlin, Army commands focused on the timing of railway junctions that would funnel troops into the heart of France. In St. Petersburg, Imperial staff debated how many corps to hold in reserve, in case Austria threatened from the south. Such meticulous planning bred a false sense of control. Each power believed that careful management of mobilization timetables would contain the conflict within certain limits. Each believed that war could be waged swiftly and decisively. Yet as weeks passed, the reality on the ground proved far more chaotic. Once armies clashed, the specter of attrition emerged. The swift victories predicted by theorists gave way to grinding engagements that consumed men and horses in bewildering numbers. The railways, strained by the movement of so many, buckled under weight and wear, causing delays that commanders had neither foreseen nor could quickly remedy. Telecommunication lines, cut by shell bursts or sabotage, plunged entire sectors into confusion. Amid this tumult, political leaders found themselves caught between military imperatives and public expectations. Some urged armistices as casualty reports grew ever more dire. Others demanded ever more fervently that the enemy be crushed without mercy. Peace overtures surfaced now and then, only to be rebuffed by hardened majorities convinced that any concession would betray national honor and the sacrifices of those who had gone before. In back rooms, diplomats whispered of neutral mediations. In public squares, orators exhorted crowds to steel themselves against an enemy depicted as barbaric and ruthless. In the midst of this tumult, ordinary life persisted in surprising ways. Families gathered around radios to hear the latest news, even as they stitched uniforms in parlors and kept gardens in bloom to supplement scarce rations. Children attended school where teachers balanced lessons in reading and arithmetic with patriotic exercises. Clergymen offered prayers for peace alongside prayers for victory. Poets penned verses that mourned the cost of war, even as they lauded the courage of the fallen. In music halls, small ensembles played somber tunes that echoed the nation's grief and resolve. As summer faded into autumn of 1914, the initial rush of enthusiasm waned under the weight of reality. The hopes for a short war gave way to the grim realization that Europe was locked in a conflict without clear end. Trenches began to appear along contested lines, transforming pastoral fields into muddy galleries of death and resilience. Soldiers wrote home of the cold nights, the scent of cordite, and the simple acts of kindness that sustained them. A shared crust of bread, a whispered joke, a letter folded into a pocket. And so, my dear friend, the slide into war was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of decisions made in earnest belief that loyalty, honor, and strength would secure peace by deterring aggression. Instead, those very measures created a momentum that none could halt. Alliances, armaments, and mobilization plans, conceived to safeguard nations, became the instruments of a war that would test the endurance of every European society and ultimately reshape the world. In our next letter, we will turn to the first true clashes of this conflict on the Western and Eastern fronts. How armies once trained for parades found themselves entangled in the brutal realities of industrialized warfare. Until then, may this understanding of how war unfolded remind us of the fragile balance between preparation for conflict and the enduring hope for peace. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 8. The First Blows. My dear friend, I write to you with a heart full of solemn duty as we leave behind the maps and plans of mobilization and step onto the fields where theory met reality. In the opening weeks of the war, armies moved with purpose born of decades of preparation, yet they encountered a world transformed by machines and fire. The great sweep of strategy gave way to the intimate moments of men confronting steel and gunpowder for the first time under the open sky. In this chapter, we will journey through the earliest clashes on the Western and Eastern fronts, tracing how the promise of a quick victory dissolved into shock and sorrow. In early August, the German army crossed into neutral Belgium to execute the eastern sweep of the plan designed to envelop Paris. On the morning of August, columns of gray uniforms streamed across the frontier, tramping through dew-damp fields and along tree-lined lanes. Belgian sentries fired warning shots and fell back, summoning reinforcements. Civilians emerged in doorways to watch the passage, uncertain whether to wave or flee. Towns such as Liège mounted a fierce defense around their ring of forts. Belgian artillery, long prepared for invasion, boomed across the Meuse and surprised officers who had counted on a swift passage. Those forts held for longer than expected, delaying the German timetable by precious days and offering hope to France and Britain that resistance might blunt the advance. As the Germans pressed southward, skirmishes erupted along the Sambre and at Charleroi. Here, on August 21st, French divisions under General Lanrezac traded blows with troops of the German Second Empire. Vast artillery barrages rolled across fields of ripe wheat and sunflower. Shell bursts churned earth into clouds of dust and smoke. Infantry advanced behind curtains of fire, only to break and reel under the hail of machine guns. Retreats and counterattacks unfolded in fits and starts as commanders sought to find weak points in each other's lines. By the end of the day, both sides had taken heavy losses and gained little ground. To the north at Mons, British expeditionary forces made their first stand. On August 23rd, the red resilient lines of the British infantry confronted the gray tides of the German First Army along the Mons Canal. Rifle volleys rang out in unison, and machine guns laid down barrages that momentarily halted the enemy. Yet the weight of numbers proved overwhelming. By dusk, the British had fired every round in their magazines and slipped away under cover of darkness. The retreat toward the Marne began in earnest, marked by rearguard actions at Le Cateau on August 26th. There, amidst a landscape scarred by steaming shell holes and twisted barbed wire, soldiers fought with desperate courage to gain time for their comrades to escape. It was on the Marne that the first true turning point occurred. From September 6th to the 9th, French and British armies counterattacked with renewed vigor. General Joffre had rallied his forces and ordered a bold strike against the exposed right flank of the German advance. Under gray morning skies, French infantry waded across the Ourcq River, while taxicabs summoned from Paris carried fresh battalions to the front. Gun crews raced to new positions and unleashed fire that shattered German formations. By the final day, the enemy lines buckled and the retreat began. For a moment, hope surged among Allied troops and civilians alike as the specter of a swift German victory faded into the past. In Belgium and northern France, civilians found their homes turned into battlefields. Families fled with only what they could carry. School children clutched dolls as they joined columns of refugees on dusty roads. Churches and town halls became improvised hospitals, their pews serving as makeshift beds. Local farmers paused in their fields, eyes haunted by the roar of guns, as they watched plumes of smoke rise over villages they had known since childhood. The sight of burned barns and shattered windows left an indelible mark on all who witnessed it, and those left behind struggled to gather firewood and food amid the destruction. Soldiers on both sides felt the full shock of modern firepower. The machine gun, once a marvel of engineering, became an instrument of terror. A single crew could lay down hundreds of bullets per minute, cutting down waves of attackers who pressed forward carrying rifles and bayonets. Artillery pieces, some weighing over a ton, roared with such force that the ground trembled beneath advancing columns. Shell fragments tore limbs and shredded clothing with equal disregard for rank or uniform. Men accustomed to manual rifles and cavalry charges found themselves huddled in shell craters, praying that the next burst would pass them by. From the first encounters, both armies learned that the tactics of old were insufficient in the face of barbed wire and rapid-fire guns. Fields once open for sweeping cavalry maneuvers were now laced with steel obstacles that could halt a horse at full gallop. Infantry found that forming into tight formations invited disaster. Soon, soldiers dug shallow trenches along ridges and behind hedgerows, fashioning makeshift defenses that offered some protection against shrapnel and bullets. These trenches grew deeper and more elaborate with each passing day, transforming pastoral landscapes into networks of earthworks that defined the new face of war. On the Eastern Front, the story unfolded with equal drama, but under different skies. Early in August, Russian armies crossed the borders of East Prussia in two massive columns. One group advanced from the north toward Königsberg, while another pushed from the south toward Gumbinnen. Their rapid advance caught German commanders by surprise, for they had committed few troops to the eastern theater. Yet the Russians encountered fierce opposition near Gumbinnen on the 23rd. German forces under General von Francois repulsed the assault, inflicting heavy casualties and setting the stage for a far more decisive engagement to come. That engagement took place between August 26th and 31st at Tannenberg. Two Russian armies converged on the small town of Allenstein, unaware of the danger that lurked in the numeral codes of their sector assignments. German commanders, notably Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, seized intelligence from intercepted Russian communications and executed a masterful counterattack. One Russian army was encircled and pushed into a swampy region, its men exhausted and supplies cut off. Tens of thousands surrendered or perished. The Second Army, hearing the guns of its sister column fall silent, found itself vulnerable and retreated in disarray. The victory at Tannenberg became legend in German circles, a testament to the power of rapid decision-making and the perils of rigid advance schedules. Not content with their triumph, the Germans pressed forward into Russian territory during the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes from the 7th to 14th. Once again, Russian forces found themselves outmaneuvered by rail-borne German divisions that struck at their flank. The frozen lakes and marshes of the Masurian region offered few hiding places for battered infantry. Supply wagons became bogged in mud, and medical units struggled to reach the wounded through broken bridges. By mid-September, the Russians had withdrawn beyond the Niemen River, their early optimism tempered by hard experience and heavy losses. Throughout these first clashes, men on both fronts kept diaries and wrote letters that offer a window into their thoughts. A Bavarian private described how he found solace in a single loaf of bread passed among friends during a night in a rain-soaked shell hole. A sergeant in the British Army penned a letter home in which he asked to be remembered not for his bravery, but for his kindness in sharing water with wounded prisoners. A Russian lieutenant wrote of the eerie calm before dawn, when the air lay still and every trooper held his breath for the whistle that would signal the next advance. Medical personnel confronted horrors beyond any peacetime practice. Ambulance convoys threaded through shell-scarred roads to reach makeshift dressing stations at crossroads and farmsteads. Doctors and nurses worked in candlelit hovels, using bandages rinsed in cold water and morphine salvaged from pre-war stocks. Wounded men lay side by side, some with maimed limbs and others blinded by concussion. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia when supplies ran low. The bond between medic and patient often transcended language and uniform, as they shared whispered prayers and held hands against the cold. Logistical challenges weighed heavily on every army. The demand for ammunition soared beyond all expectations. Munitions factories operated night and day, filling crates with artillery shells that armies struggled to transport to the front. Horses, the lifeblood of cavalry units and supply convoys, succumbed to exhaustion and disease. Soldiers learned to conserve fodder and clean tack in freezing dawns. Civilians near rail depots took part in unloading trains, passing sacks of flour and hay from hand to hand. Yet despite these efforts, ration lines grew longer, and hunger became as great a foe as any enemy soldier. Communication stood at the heart of these battles and often broke down under fire. Field telephones, strung along miles of cable, hissed with static when shells severed lines. Runners carried messages through open fields at great risk, only to find orders outdated by the time they arrived. Signal flags and flares lit the night sky, but interpreting their meaning in the smoke of battle tested even the most seasoned officers. Early reconnaissance aircraft offered a glimpse of enemy positions, though their cameras were bulky and their pilots vulnerable to ground fire. In this environment of bewildering noise and confusion, those who could adapt their messages on the fly often found themselves with a fleeting advantage. By late September of 1914, it had become clear that the war would not be won in days or weeks. The vivid dreams of rapid victory collapsed under the weight of casualties counting in the hundreds of thousands. The fields of northern France and East Prussia were littered with wounded men and spent cartridges. The armies faced each other across a front stretching hundreds of miles, with trenches forming the front lines. Both sides dug in, perplexed by the challenge of breaking through defenses reinforced by machine guns and barbed wire. As I write these words, I find myself humbled by the contrast between the carefully drawn strategies of peace and the grim realities of the first blows. What began as swift advances gave way to the slow labor of digging and defending. What seemed an adventure for young officers soon became a test of endurance for thousands of common soldiers. The shock of this modern industrial warfare would reverberate through all the campaigns that followed, reshaping not only armies, but the societies that sustained them. In our next letter, we will explore the deepening stalemate that emerged from these early battles, the birth of trench warfare, and how men found new ways to fight and to live amid the mud and wire. Until then, may this understanding of the first blows remind us of the human cost behind every strategic map and every grand design. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 9. Trenches and Stalemate. My dear friend, as I set quill to paper this evening, I find myself reflecting on how the grand designs of strategy and the stirring words of generals gave way to a more humbling reality, one measured in yards of earth, tangled wire, and the daily labors of men who dug into the soil to hold their ground. In the weeks following the fierce battles of the Marne and Tannenberg, a grim pattern emerged across the Western Front. Neither side could secure a decisive advantage. Instead, Both armies settled into lines of trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. It was here, amid the mud and the wire, that the war found its lasting shape. In this chapter, I wish to describe the birth of trench warfare and how it imposed a slow, grinding stalemate upon Europe's armies and peoples alike. By October of 1914, the high hopes for a war of movement had evaporated. After the French and British push at the Marne, the German army fell back into fortified positions near the Aisne River. French troops, urged on by patriotic fervor, charged across open fields only to be halted by well-placed machine guns and thick belts of barbed wire. Every advance exacted a terrible toll in lives. Commanders on both sides recognized that traditional frontal assaults would now only lead to slaughter. In response, men began to dig. What began as shallow foxholes soon multiplied into elaborate systems of trenches. Soldiers used shovels scavenged from supply dumps or improvised tools fashioned from shell fragments. They dug in layers. The frontline trench lay 5 to 10 yards from the enemy, separated by a deadly expanse known as no man's land. Behind it ran support trenches, connected by communication trenches that snaked back to regimental headquarters and supply points. Farther still lay reserve trenches where fresh battalions waited to relieve the exhausted frontliners. The construction of these trenches was a feat of labor under fire. Night after night, wiring parties crept into no man's land to repair or extend barbed wire obstacles. They moved in small groups, carrying coils of wire and pickets, their figures ghostly in the line of flares overhead. German sentries listened for the faint click of tools on wire and sometimes turned on their machine guns without warning. Many wiring parties paid with their lives. Yet each strand of wire hastily stapled into the ground added a fraction of safety to the trench behind it. Within the trenches, conditions grew harsh almost immediately. Walls of earth soaked up rain until they collapsed in on soldiers, forcing them to shore up the sides with wooden planks or corrugated iron salvaged from bombed-out farmhouses. Water pooled in the bottom of the trenches, sometimes ankle-deep, chilling men to the bone in early winter. Rats scurried along the duckboards that kept feet above the sludge, feasting on rations and the bodies of the fallen. Lice bred in uniforms and tunneled into hair, causing continual itching and distress. Daily life in the trenches became a rhythm of routines interrupted by terror. Each morning at first light, sentries on lookout called out "Stand to," and every rifleman snapped to attention with bayonet fixed, scanning no man's land for signs of movement. Breakfast rations arrived in tin cans, hardtack biscuits, tinned meat, and tea brewing over small stoves. Men polished tools and weapons in the half-light, patched clothing, and wrote letters home with stubby pencils on damp paper. If the weather held, parties went out to repair trenches or lay fresh duckboards. If the weather turned foul, soldiers huddled in dugouts carved into the bank, cramped bunkers with narrow passages where dozens could shelter from shelling. Speaking of shelling, artillery became king of the trenches. Each side emplaced batteries in concealed positions behind the lines. When an attack was planned, the guns opened with a creeping barrage, shells fired just ahead of advancing infantry to keep defenders' heads down. Many casualties occurred not to infantry fire, but to high explosive shells bursting overhead. The concussion could stun or kill, and the fragments tore through limbs and skulls with equal cruelty. Every explosion shook the ground and rattled men's bones. Yet they learned to endure, clutching their helmets and covering their ears as if braced for some storm. On quiet days, the silence weighed as heavily as any bombardment. In the gaps between firing, men listened for birdsong or the distant chug of supply trucks. They recalled childhood fields or memories of laughter in village squares. Some sang softly to calm frayed nerves. Letters from home, when permitted by censorship, provided solace. A mother's news of a new calf born on the farm, a sweetheart's poem penned in neat handwriting. Such comfort sustained morale even as hope waned. Winter turned the trenches into icy hellscapes. Freezing temperatures coated rifle barrels in ice. Water-filled trenches transformed into rivers of slush that froze overnight. Frostbitten feet became common, and medical officers diagnosed trench foot, gangrene that cut men's toes and sometimes feet from their limbs. Medical stations, once hastily established in shell-shattered cottages, now served as clearing posts where surgeons labored by lamplight to treat wounds with limited supplies. They used ether when they had it. When they did not, they did what they could, guiltily aware of the worsening pain of amputations performed without full anesthesia. Despite the horrors, soldiers found moments of human connection. Night raids became an opportunity to gather intelligence or take prisoners. Small teams crossed no man's land, creeping low under moonlight to lift enemy helmets or snatch a captured rifle. If they succeeded, they might return with a prisoner for interrogation or a captured map. Exchanges sometimes unfolded of cigarettes and chocolate between trenches when lulls in the fighting occurred. Enemy voices drifted across the wire. Have a smoke? How are you holding up? Such moments of shared humanity punctured the isolation of trench life. The stalemate settled in deeply by early 1915. Neither side could break through without incurring losses that no army could replace easily. Generals searched for new methods. Tunneling companies drove shafts under enemy trenches, packing them with explosives to blow gaps in the wire walls. Poison gas, first used by the Germans at Ypres in April, introduced a new terror. Chlorine clouds drifted across the land, turning lungs to fire and causing choking deaths in the open. Mustard gas followed, staining the skin and eyes, inflicting burns that left men blinded for days. Masks and protective gear offered only partial relief. Gas attacks heightened dread on both sides and deepened the sense of a war without limits. As the trench lines hardened, both armies looked beyond the Western Front for opportunities. In the east, the Russians still pressed, though their supply lines strained with overstretched railways. In the south, campaigns in the Balkans and the Dardanelles sought to relieve pressure on the main fronts and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Colonial soldiers from India, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa joined the fray, bringing fresh troops and a different perspective on this European conflict. Their arrival provided crucial support but also reminded all that the war had become global in reach. Back home, families and communities grappled with the realities of stalemate. Governments organized war bond drives to finance the massive efforts required. Posters exhorting citizens to do your bit and remember Belgium adorned station platforms and shop windows. Women entered factories in droves, working shifts assembling shells, weaving uniforms, and fixing engines for transport vehicles. Agricultural production focused on feeding both civilians and armies, with victory gardens springing up in vacant lots to help supplement food shortages. The press worked under censorship, but nevertheless conveyed a sense of endurance rather than victory. Newspapers printed photos of smiling soldiers in empty trenches, cleaning rifles, or playing cards to show that morale remained high. Stories of individual acts of heroism, rescuing a wounded comrade under fire, or holding a section of trench against overwhelming odds, provided examples of courage. Yet every such story was balanced by casualty lists that grew ever longer. When a loved one's name appeared among the missing, communities sent aid to families in mourning and remembered the sacrifices made for the common cause. In some towns, letters arrived from wounded veterans who returned to parades of sympathy, limping on crutches but determined to demonstrate that they bore no bitterness. Speaking engagements brought them before crowds to tell tales not of glory, but of the senseless waste of trench warfare. Such testimonies began to sway public opinion in subtle ways, sowing seeds of doubt about the ultimate success of a war that rarely saw sweeping victories. Pacifist organizations, though suppressed in many countries, circulated leaflets urging truce and negotiation, the first stirrings of a broader peace movement that would gain strength as the years wore on. By spring of 1916, the trench lines had become as familiar as the streets of a city. Both sides honed their defenses, building concrete bunkers, dugouts that ran several stories deep, and steel-reinforced machine gun emplacements. Waterproof shelters allowed small garrisons to withstand days of shelling without relief. Observers in steel-clad pillboxes monitored the fields through periscopes, calling in artillery coordinates with unsettling precision. Engineers wired tripwires and laid mines in unexpected places to thwart night raiders. In areas where geography permitted, trenches wound through woods or high ground, offering vantage points to sweep the approaches with rifle fire. Yet for all the ingenuity, the underlying truth remained that neither army could dislodge the other without paying a crushing price. Attempts at breakthrough at Verdun on the French side, at the Somme under British command, promised decisive results but delivered painful lessons in attrition. Day after day, wave after wave of soldiers moved across no man's land, only to be cut down by the combined firepower of rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Months of planning culminated in gains measured in mere yards. Each yard demanded a fresh assault, fresh casualties, and fresh burials in rows of white crosses that rose on plowed fields like grim reminders of the cost. It was in this grinding stalemate that the nature of modern war revealed itself most starkly. Technological advances, airplanes for reconnaissance, wireless telegraphy for coordination, motorized ambulances for evacuation, coexisted with archaic horrors, hand-to-hand combat in confined saps, grappling over muddy breastworks, moments when men fought with bayonets or entangled themselves in wire as shells burst around them. The war became a vast laboratory of human suffering, engineering, and endurance. Each side learned to adapt, to innovate small improvements in trench drainage, to refine gas masks, to develop creeping barrages that inched forward at a pace designed to keep up with infantry. In the midst of this turmoil, the voices of poets and writers captured the paradox of life in the trenches. Soldiers composed verses on scraps of paper that circulated in dugouts, lines of bleak humor about mud so deep it swallowed kit, quatrains about the flicker of friendship that warmed shattered hearts, elegies for comrades whose laughter once echoed in sunlit fields. These words found their way back to families, offering glimpses into a world beyond scandalized headlines and official communiques. Civilians, too, sought meaning in this brutal tableau. Artists painted canvases of shattered trees and empty craters. Musicians composed somber anthems that echoed in concert halls converted to recruitment centers. Scholars wrote essays debating the morality of industrialized slaughter. Religious leaders preached sermons that alternately justified the war as a defense of civilization and lamented the slaughter as a failure of humanity to heed the principles of compassion. As the stalemate dragged on, the very concept of victory grew ambiguous. Was victory the capture of a few miles of trench? The endurance of a people under blockade and bombardment? The weakening of an enemy's will? Governments recognized that total victory might never come unless one side collapsed from exhaustion. Plans for breaking the deadlock turned to new instruments, tanks that could cross wire and churn through mud, deeper mining operations under enemy strongholds, intensified bombing of supply lines to starve the front. Each innovation offered a glimmer of hope, yet carried the risk of unforeseen consequences in a war that had already proven unpredictable. In quiet moments, soldiers gazed across no man's land at the enemy trenches, so near and yet impassable. They caught glimpses of faces in periscopes or heard rival voices sung in different tongues. The shared fatigue and suffering sometimes fostered a grudging respect for the foe, an enemy as human, as weary, and as homesick as themselves. Yet orders and ideology insisted on hatred and dehumanization, and the mask of combat made such personal bonds rare. By mid-May 1916, the trenches had become monuments to the futility of limited aims and the peril of unchecked militarism. Entire generations of young men learned that modern war was not a brief gala of patriotic ceremonies, but a protracted ordeal demanding the utmost endurance of body and spirit. Behind the lines, societies adjusted to the realities of stalemate, ration cards, substitution of women for men in factories, the constant hum of propaganda urging citizens to endure until the final victory. As I close this letter, I am filled with both sorrow and awe. Sorrow for the unimaginable suffering endured by those who lived and died in these trenches. Awe at the capacity of human beings to adapt, to find humor in hardship, to show kindness in misery, and to preserve a sense of self amid the clamor of guns. In our next chapter, we will turn our gaze to the global reach of the conflict, the role of colonial soldiers drawn from distant lands, and how the war's consequences extended far beyond the mud of northern France. Until then, may we remember that even in the darkest trenches, the human spirit struggled to survive. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 10: Global Reach and Colonial Soldiers. My dear friend, I hope this letter finds you in good health and calm spirits as we journey beyond the fields of Europe to explore how this great conflict spread to every corner of the globe. What began as a clash among continental powers soon became an imperial enterprise of vast scale, drawing millions from distant lands into a war they had never sought but could not avoid. In this chapter, I wish to trace how the colonies of Europe answered the call, how soldiers from India, Africa, the Antipodes, and beyond took the field, and how the engines of empire propelled the war into a global struggle. Early in the conflict, as the drumbeats of mobilization echoed through the capitals of Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and their allies turned to their colonies for manpower and resources. Colonial governors in India, West Africa, North Africa, and Southeast Asia issued orders summoning recruits from across provinces and protectorates. Whitehall and Paris conjured regiments of men who had never laid eyes upon each other, but found themselves bound by imperial duty. In numerous colonial cities, from Calcutta to Casablanca, recruiting offices opened their doors to volunteers eager to defend crowns and republics half a world away. In India, the largest of Britain's possessions, the call to arms resonated deeply. Young men from Punjab, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay enlisted in what came to be known as the Indian Expeditionary Force. They traveled by troopship across the Arabian Sea to Suez, and then northward to the battlefields of France and Flanders. Their turbans and lungis stood out amid the khaki of European regiments, yet they adapted swiftly to the rigors of trench life. They learned to maneuver their light infantry tactics in concert with British units, and their valor in battles such as Neuve-Chapelle and Loos earned them the admiration of their comrades. On the Western Front, these Indian soldiers faced conditions they had never anticipated. They stood knee-deep in freezing mud and rain, yet they delivered precise volleys of rifle fire when ordered and advanced with grim determination when called upon. They endured the shock of shell fire and the horror of gas attacks, yet they tended to the wounded of their own battalions and those of allies. Their letters home spoke of camaraderie born of shared hardship, of the curious delight in British tea served in dugouts, and of their longing for the scent of mustard fields back home. For many, this war was their first journey beyond the monsoons and the familiar music of temple bells. Not to be outdone, soldiers from French North Africa answered the tricolor's summons with equal fervor. Regiments of Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians were formed into what the French called the Zouaves and the tirailleurs Senegalese. These men arrived on the quays of Marseille and were transported northward to meet the German onslaught. In the thick fog of the Ardennes and the shell-scarred ruins of Verdun, they fought with fearless resolve. Their discipline under fire and their skill with the bayonet became the subject of admiration among French officers who once doubted their fighting capacity. Senegalese tirailleurs, recruited not only from Senegal but also from neighboring territories, endured the climate of Europe with stoic endurance. They sang their folk songs in the darkness of trenches to soothe their nerves and maintain traditions of dress and ritual even as they adopted French uniforms. After battles, they washed their faces in rainwater and sharpened their kukris alongside French comrades who marveled at the skill of their marksmanship. The sacrifice of these troops was immense, as their casualty rates often exceeded those of metropolitan units. From the southern hemisphere came the Australians and New Zealanders, whose contributions would become legendary at Gallipoli and later on the Western Front. In September of 1914, the first convoys of the Australian Imperial Force and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force embarked for Egypt. There they trained under desert skies before embarking on the ill-fated campaign at the Dardanelles. At Anzac Cove, they encountered steep cliffs, tangled scrub, and a determined Ottoman defense. Despite these challenges, they established footholds on the beaches and held firm for months in the face of repeated counterattacks. The Anzac experience tested not only their courage but also their ingenuity. They built rudimentary water catchment systems in narrow gullies, devised makeshift shelters from timber and canvas, and positioned rifles to cover narrow gullies. They learned to forage for wild fruits to supplement their rations and to form impromptu field kitchens beneath olive trees. Their letters spoke of the strange beauty of the Aegean sunsets, even as they lamented the loss of friends struck down by shellfire. When the evacuation came in December of 1915, they withdrew with their heads held high, having forged bonds of brotherhood in adversity. Following Gallipoli, the Anzac troops were redeployed to the Western Front, where they distinguished themselves at battles such as Poitiers and Passchendaele. Clad in their slouch hats and leather leggings, they advanced across the mud with quiet determination. Their experiences at Mouquet Farm, where they held onto captured trenches under relentless shelling, became the subject of commemorative songs and poems in distant Australian towns. New Zealanders, too, remembered their efforts at Maecenas Ridge, where they helped detonate the great mines beneath the German lines and witnessed the earth tremble in a vast upheaval of smoke and debris. Meanwhile, in the vast expanses of Africa, the war took on a different character. German colonial possessions in East Africa, what is now Tanzania, became the front line of a guerrilla campaign led by the German officer Paul von Lettow-Warbeck. Allied forces composed of African Askari troops under British and Belgian command pursued von Lettow-Warbeck's guerrillas through dense bush, across rivers, and over hills. These African soldiers, some volunteering from Kenya, Uganda, and the Belgian Congo, endured malaria, Tsetse fly bites, and long marches on half rations. They learned to fight in small detachments, to camouflage themselves with local foliage, and to strike swiftly before melting back into the jungle. At the same time, West African regiments played a crucial role in campaigns in Cameroon and Togo. Infantrymen from the Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and other territories swelled the ranks of the West African Frontier Force. They moved along bush roads and narrow coastal paths, engaging German colonial troops and securing strategic rail lines. Their valor in actions such as the capture of Garoua in 1915 earned them commendations and the respect of British officers who had once doubted the fighting quality of African units. The global reach of the war extended even further east. In Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, soldiers of the Indian Army advanced up the Tigris and Euphrates toward Baghdad. They endured scorpion-infested camps and waterborne diseases such as cholera and dysentery. Though they captured cities such as Basra and Kut, the campaign took a heavy toll. Medical officers worked feverishly in field hospitals to treat dysentery patients and to mend limbs shattered by modern artillery. Their exploits on the banks of the Shatt al-Arab found a place in Indian newspapers, inspiring families thousands of miles away to follow the progress of their soldiers through weekly bulletins. In the Sinai and Palestine, soldiers from the British Indian Army and local Bedouin tribesmen joined cavalry and infantry brigades in a sweeping campaign against the Ottoman forces. They crossed the Sinai Desert on foot and in camel-drawn carts, forged water wells under artillery cover, and traveled under scorching sun to break through German-built defenses. At the Battle of Megiddo in September of 1918, they captured thousands of prisoners and contributed to the collapse of Ottoman authority in the region. The victories that followed opened the way for British rule over Palestine and set the stage for the complex political legacies that would shape the 20th century. The French also drew heavily on colonial manpower in the Levant and North Africa. Moroccan Goumiers served with distinction in mountain warfare along the Western Front and later in Italy during the fighting around Monte Cassino. Their skill at navigating difficult terrain and their fierce fighting spirit made them invaluable allies. In Lebanon and Syria, colonial troops helped secure French mandates after the war, enforcing order and building new administrative structures in territories once under Ottoman rule. Beyond combat roles, colonial populations served behind the lines in indispensable support functions. The Chinese Labor Corps, recruited by Britain and France from northern China, labored in munitions depots, laid railway lines, and worked in ordnance factories. They chalked chalk lines on battlefield maps, unloaded coal ships at docks, and toiled in quarries to produce vast quantities of stone for roads and fortifications. Though they wore no uniforms and carried no rifles, their labor underpinned the logistical efforts that kept the army supplied. Similarly, West Indian regiments from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados served in both combat and support posts. They guarded lines of communication, worked as stretcher bearers, and at times took part in trench raids. Their drums and Caribbean rhythms provided a measure of comfort to weary soldiers on leave, and their stories of home inspired agricultural experiments in Europe's grim villages. Their contributions, though often overlooked in official histories, formed an essential part of the war effort. The Imperial Japanese Navy, too, played a global role. Under the Anglo-Japanese alliance, Japanese destroyers patrolled the Mediterranean Sea, escorting Allied merchant ships and hunting German U-boats. Their presence reassured supply lines between Europe and its colonies in Asia and Australasia. Meanwhile, Japan seized German possessions in the Pacific, Shandong in China, the Caroline Islands, the Mariana Islands, and others, shifting the balance of power in East Asia and planting the seeds of future rivalries. The global conflict also reshaped commerce and resource distribution. Rubber from Malaya, tin from the Malay Peninsula, cotton from Egypt, and wheat from Canada became vital to the munitions factories of Europe. Colonial plantations and farms increased production under state direction. Gouverneurs and resident commissioners imposed quotas on growers and requisitioned ships to carry goods to European markets. In many colonies, new roads and railways were built to expedite the movement of food and raw materials, improvements that outlasted the war and transformed local economies. Allied shipping convoys, defended by naval escorts from Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Japan, threaded their way through Mediterranean and Atlantic waters. Merchant sailors from India, China, the Caribbean, and the British Isles found themselves on the same bridges and in the same engine rooms. They faced storms at sea and the threat of U-boat attacks, relying on lookouts posted high atop masts and on sonar systems newly introduced to detect submerged submarines. Their stories of close calls and narrow escapes became the stuff of seafaring legend. Throughout this global conflagration, colonial societies underwent profound changes. The shared danger and sacrifice fueled demands for greater political representation. Indian leaders who had supported the war effort in hopes that it would bring constitutional reforms found themselves emboldened to press for self-government. In Egypt, nationalist movements gained momentum as locals who had served in the war returned with a broadened sense of their rights and possibilities. In West Africa and North Africa, veterans formed associations demanding fair treatment and equality under the law. Across the colonies, the war planted the seeds of future independence movements. When the armistice finally came on November 1918, the map of the world had been redrawn. Former German colonies became mandates under the League of Nations, entrusted to Britain or France to administer. The promise of self-determination, articulated at war's end by President Wilson, echoed in the hearts of colonial peoples whose sacrifices had won the day. Yet the task of fulfilling that promise proved more complex than any had imagined. As I fold this letter, I marvel at how a conflict that began in Europe stretched across oceans and deserts, forests and mountains, touching every nation and culture bound by the empires of the time. Soldiers from the Punjab and the Senegal, from Queensland and Quebec, from the Caribbean and China, stood shoulder to shoulder with Europeans in mud and blood. Their contributions shaped the course of the war and altered the destiny of their own lands. In our next letter, we will turn our gaze inward to the home fronts of Europe and the colonies, how civilians coped with shortages, how women transformed industry and society, and how the echoes of global sacrifice resonated in daily life. Until then, may the memory of these colonial soldiers guide us toward a deeper understanding of our shared history. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 11. The Home Fronts. My dear friend, as the years of conflict wore on, the battlefields of Europe remained ever more entrenched, yet another struggle took shape behind the lines. On the home fronts of the warring nations, civilians found themselves enlisted in roles they had never imagined, their daily lives transformed by shortages, regulations, and a shared determination to support the armies abroad. In this chapter, let us turn our gaze inward and explore how societies coped with scarcities of food and fuel, how women stepped into industries once reserved for men, and how the echoes of global sacrifice shaped the rhythms of towns and villages from Paris to Pretoria. Even before the first winter of war settled over Europe, governments recognized the need to manage resources more carefully than ever before. Foodstuffs that once moved freely across borders became precious commodities. Butter and sugar, once staples of morning breakfasts, were rationed in Britain, France, and Germany alike. Ration cards were issued to every household, entitling each person to a fixed quantity of meat, flour, and fats each week. Housewives learned to stretch meager supplies by substituting margarine for butter and using root vegetables like swedes and turnips in stews. Cookbooks printed special wartime editions offering recipes for mock dishes, such as potato dumplings seasoned with herbs in place of scarce meat. Behind these home kitchens, vast government agencies coordinated the allocation of supplies. Ministries of food organized price controls and oversaw the distribution of staples to urban and rural districts. Local committees, made up of volunteers, monitored the sale of goods to prevent hoarding and black marketeering. City dwellers queued outside municipal soup kitchens where a penny might buy a cup of broth thickened with barley and lentils. At the same time, farmers faced new incentives to increase production. Women's Land Army units recruited country folk to tend fields left untended by conscripted men. These recruits, clad in practical overalls and wide-brimmed hats, turned over the soil, planted crops, and harvested grain, working from dawn until dusk under the watchful eye of agricultural instructors. Fuel shortages posed a separate but equally pressing challenge. Coal and oil were diverted to military uses, leaving factories, railways, and homes facing rationing. In Britain, families burned peat and peat briquettes beside hearths once fed by coal. In Germany, wood fuel became essential for cooking and heating, leading to renewed interest in forest management and tree planting. Cities imposed gasless Sundays during daylight hours to conserve gas used for street lighting. Electric tram services reduced their schedules, and in some towns, drivers replaced petrol with charcoal gas produced from local wood supplies. These innovations proved vital, but also tested the endurance of citizens unaccustomed to such deprivation. Amid the exigencies of scarcity, a profound social transformation took place. With men away at the front, women entered factories, shipyards, and munitions works in unprecedented numbers. In Britain's munitions plants, known as shell houses, women operated heavy machinery that pressed and filled shells with high explosives. Their hands learned the precise motions of lathe work and riveting, and their determination earned them the nickname munitionettes. To protect their hearing from the constant roar of machinery, they invented makeshift earplugs from cotton and wax. Factory managers instituted rotating shifts to keep production going around the clock, and women answered the call with stoic perseverance. The demands of war extended beyond armaments to transportation and engineering. Shipyards along the Clyde and the Tyne in Britain hired women to fit plates on warships and drive steam hammers. In Germany, armament firms employed female metalworkers to assemble rifles and artillery breeches. To recruit and train these new workers, governments and private firms established technical schools offering evening classes in mechanics, welding, and drafting. The technical competence women displayed during these efforts challenged long-held assumptions about gender roles and laid the groundwork for future advances in women's labor rights. Agriculture, too, felt the impact of women's growing presence in the workforce. The Land Army in Britain grew from a few hundred volunteers in 1915 to over 200,000 by 1918. Women drove tractors, milked cows, and managed dairy herds. In France, rural communes formed ladies' brigades to replace conscripted men in vineyard pruning and fruit picking. Belgian refugees who had fled German occupation helped tend fields in northern France, their expertise welcomed by beleaguered farmers. These efforts prevented catastrophic crop failures and demonstrated that women could not only sustain but also innovate in essential industries. Children and the elderly also contributed to the home front efforts. School children collected waste paper, bones, and metal scraps in local drives organized by town councils. These materials were recycled into ammunition cases, fertilizer, and spare parts. Scout groups knelt on pavements, filling sacks with old newspapers and tins from doorstep collections. In towns across Europe, grandmothers volunteered at canteens for railway workers and nurses' hostels, offering cups of tea and freshly baked bread to weary travelers and caregivers. Such communal efforts depended upon effective communication and morale building. Governments relied on posters, newspapers, and early newsreels to rally public spirit. In Berlin, artists designed striking images of sturdy workers under slogans urging, "Every woman a munitions worker," and "Coal is your weapon." In London, Bill Banks' posters showed a woman bending rivets under the proclamation, "We can take it." In Paris, newspapers published front-page photographs of smiling factory girls beneath headlines, celebrating victory through production. These messages combined patriotic fervor with practical appeals, reminding citizens that their daily labors were as vital to victory as the actions of soldiers in the trenches. Yet propaganda faced the challenge of honest reporting. As casualty lists mounted and food shortages deepened, public trust wavered. Strikes broke out in munitions factories and shipyards as workers demanded higher wages and shorter hours. In Britain's industrial heartland, skilled laborers formed unions to press for better conditions, while in Germany, socialist groups called for peace negotiations. Governments responded by curtailing labor rights and imposing censorship, but they also increased pay in key industries and offered recognition in the form of medals and certificates. Many workers accepted the hardships as part of a shared sacrifice, but the home front revealed that no society could sustain war efforts indefinitely without attending to the needs and grievances of its citizens. Religious and charitable organizations played a complementary role. Churches opened restrooms where munitions workers could escape the grime of factories, enjoy a warm meal, and hear words of comfort from chaplains. In France, Catholic sisters ran convalescent homes for women suffering from industrial injuries. In Britain, the Women's Voluntary Service organized knitting circles to supply warm garments for soldiers abroad. Voluntary ambulance and nursing services recruited women to serve both at home and near the front, tending to air raid victims, accident casualties, and elderly residents displaced by bombings. Education continued under the strains of war. Schools adapted curricula to include lessons in first aid, gas mask drills, and air raid precautions. Girl Guides and Boy Scouts received training in signaling and map reading. University students formed university regiments for auxiliary service, including wireless operation and mechanical repairs. Such activities instilled a sense of purpose among youth, even as examinations were postponed and campuses converted into hospitals for wounded soldiers. The emotional burden of wartime life weighed heavily on families. Letters and postcards became lifelines between the front and the home. Postal services worked overtime to carry missives of reassurance and news of births, marriages, and deaths. In many regions, comfort committees assembled parcels of clothing, cigarettes, and toiletries to send to soldiers. Postal workers, braving snow and rain, delivered these parcels alongside letters, offering brief moments of joy to weary men in uniform. Grief and loss permeated the home fronts. Every town boasted a war memorial plaque honoring local sons and daughters who had fallen. Churchyards saw fresh graves laid for soldiers who succumbed to wounds brought home. Widows and orphans received pensions, though these often proved inadequate. Community support networks emerged to aid bereaved families, offering food parcels and small stipends. Local councils organized memorial services on Armistice Day, inviting everyone to lay wreaths and observe 2 minutes of silence. These rituals bound communities together in remembrance and underscored the shared cost of conflict. Across Europe and in the colonies, minorities and marginalized groups found both opportunity and discrimination. In Britain, Jewish and Irish communities grappled with divided loyalties, balancing support for the war with concerns about domestic injustice. In colonial contexts, leaders encouraged loyalty among local elites but often withheld political rights. Indian nationalists pointed out that while Indian soldiers fought and died for the empire, they remained subjects without a voice in decision-making. Similar sentiments arose in Egypt and North Africa, where conscripted soldiers returned demanding greater autonomy. Governments responded with a mix of repression and reform, fearing that unrest at home might undermine the war effort. The home fronts extended beyond Europe's borders in equal measure. In Canada and Australia, patriotic fervor drove massive volunteer enlistment, yet conscription referendums revealed deep divisions over compulsion. In South Africa, black and colored populations served as laborers and porters, though they received fewer benefits than white veterans. Japanese civilians in territories held under treaty rights organized fundraisers for Allied relief, while public meetings debated the proper role of their navy in distant theaters. Latin American countries saw economic booms supplying food and raw materials to Europe even as they maintained formal neutrality. Economic adjustments became a constant necessity. Inflation soared as currency values fluctuated and imports fell. Governments raised new taxes, sold war bonds, and borrowed heavily from international lenders. In Britain, the victory loan campaigns promoted subscriptions with patriotic spectacles, while in France, public lotteries contributed to war finance. Investment in war industries offered steady returns for some, but also fueled speculation and profiteering, leading to public outcry against a war economy that seemed to reward the few while demanding sacrifices from the many. Culture and entertainment provided relief from the austerity of war. Music halls staged patriotic reviews featuring songs extolling courage and longing for peace. Cinema houses showed newsreels of battlefield scenes alongside comedies that offered laughter in dark times. Book publishers reissued classics alongside new novels that captured the mood of the era. From sentimental tales of separation and reunion to grim narratives of trench warfare that filtered back through correspondence. Radio broadcasts, where available, brought speeches by political leaders and musical performances into drawing rooms, knitting distant listeners into a single audience. As the war dragged on, the very idea of victory took on new dimensions. It was not enough to vanquish the enemy armies. Victory also meant ensuring the survival of the nation at home. Governments spoke of total war, a concept that encompassed both military and civilian spheres. Every citizen became a combatant in spirit, responsible for conserving resources, maintaining morale, and supporting the children and elderly who could not serve at the front. Educational campaigns urged soldiers' families to plant victory gardens in backyards, to mend and repurpose clothing, and to avoid waste in every aspect of life. Through these efforts, the home fronts preserved the flow of men and material to the battlefields, yet they also sowed the seeds of change. Women's contributions in industry and agriculture bolstered calls for equal political rights at war's end. Labor disputes revealed the need for more equitable social orders. The shared hardships of ordinary people created new bonds across class lines and regions, and the experience of total war underscored the interdependence of nations, laying the groundwork for post-war discussions of collective security and international cooperation. As I conclude this letter, I am struck by the resilience and sacrifice of those who remained while others marched to the front. Their courage in facing hunger, cold, and anxiety sustained the armies abroad and helped preserve the very societies threatened by this global conflict. In our next letter, we will turn our attention to the arrival of fresh forces on the Western Front as a new power entered the fray. Until then, may we honor the memory of those whose labors at home proved as essential to victory as the valor of soldiers in the trenches. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 12. A new player, America enters the fray. My dear friend, I trust this letter finds you in good health and serenity amid these tumultuous times. Thus far, we have traversed the tangled roots of the war, the rivalries of empires, the grind of trench warfare, and the sacrifices of millions. In this chapter, I wish to turn our gaze across the Atlantic and describe how the United States, once determined to remain aloof, was drawn inexorably into the conflict. We will see how neutrality gave way to engagement, how American industry and manpower bolstered the weary Allies, and how a new spirit entered the fray in the spring of 1917. For nearly 3 years after August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed a policy of strict neutrality. In Washington, he spoke of peace without victory, urging belligerents to respect international law and to spare civilian lives. The mood in American cities varied. German Americans organized convivial societies to send relief packages to relatives back home. Irish Americans, still smarting from Britain's repression in Ireland, cheered German successes. Meanwhile, British sympathies ran deep among those of British descent and in the major ports where trade remained brisk. Newspapers filled their pages with vivid accounts of European battles, filtering them through editorial stances that ranged from isolationist caution to fervent interventionism. Despite official neutrality, America's economy became, in effect, the arsenal of democracy. American bankers extended loans to Britain and France, confident in Allied prospects. Shipyards along the Atlantic seaboard hummed with activity, building cargo vessels and troop transports under contract. Steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio worked around the clock to produce rails, beams, and armor plate. Farmers in the Midwest plowed extra fields of wheat and corn, heeding government appeals to feed the world. Such massive production created jobs, and a sense that, though not yet at war, America was already inextricably linked to the Allied cause. The turning point came in early 1917, as Germany, frustrated by British blockades, resumed its campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st of May. German U-boats began sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic without warning, aiming to starve Britain into submission. On March 7th of March, the British liner SS Lusitania had already suffered that violent fate in 1915, but now the attacks widened to include ships flying the American flag. By 21st, the British merchantman Falaba, carrying American passengers, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. Though protests had followed earlier sinkings, this renewed campaign threatened American commerce and lives on an unprecedented scale. Simultaneously, the British government revealed the contents of the Zimmermann telegram. In this secret dispatch, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, Germany's foreign minister proposed a military alliance with Mexico should the United States enter the war against Germany. In return, Mexico would recover its lost provinces of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. As news of this brazen scheme spread through American newspapers, shock gave way to indignation. Citizens who had once sympathized with neutrality now pressed Congress and the president to defend national honor and security. On April 2nd, President Wilson addressed a joint session of Congress. He spoke of a world safe for democracy, of measures forced upon the United States by acts of piracy, and of obligations to the law of nations. On April 6, 1917, Congress approved the declaration of war against Germany. That same day, cheers rose in New York's Times Square, in factories along the Great Lakes, and on farms in Dakota and Kansas. Appeals for volunteers echoed in town halls and downtown movie theaters. By month's end, more than 125,000 men had enlisted in the United States Army. Yet despite this initial surge, the American Army faced a daunting task. General John J. Pershing, appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, insisted on maintaining an independent American command rather than dispersing units among British or French armies. He believed that American troops must fight shoulder to shoulder as a national force, both to secure a distinct contribution and to bolster home front morale. To build that force, Congress enacted the Selective Service Act on May 18, 1917. Registration boards sprang up in every county, and by November, nearly 2.8 million men had been drafted. They reported to training camps: Camp Funston in Kansas, Camp Meade in Maryland, Camp Dodge in Iowa, where they learned to drill, to handle rifles and machine guns, and to withstand the rigors of modern warfare. Behind this recruitment surge lay America's vast industrial might. The War Industries Board, established in July 1917 under Bernard Baruch, coordinated civilian factories to prioritize war orders. Car manufacturers retooled to build trucks and artillery tractors. Clothing mills churned out uniforms by the tens of thousands. Shipyards contracted for Liberty ships and smaller coastal freighters to replace those lost to U-boats. Railroads moved supplies under government control, and standardized gauges and couplings sped logistics. All told, by the end of 1918, American factories produced more munitions and supplies than any other nation involved in the war. Women on the home front again rose to the occasion. As millions of men donned uniforms, women filled their posts in munitions plants, signal corps, telephone exchanges, and transportation services. The Navy and the Marine Corps commissioned yeomanettes, women who served as clerks and radio operators. More than 12,000 nurses of the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps volunteered for duty overseas, tending to the sick and wounded in U.S. Army base hospitals scattered across France. These women, clad in crisp uniforms and sturdy shoes, drove ambulances, set up aid stations near the front lines, and administered anesthesia in field hospitals. African American soldiers also answered the call, though they faced segregation and discrimination within the U.S. Army. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, was assigned to fight under French command, where they shed their American ties to earn respect at Verdun and along the Meuse-Argonne. Clad in blue French uniforms and armed with French rifles, they served longer on the front lines than any other American unit and returned home decorated with the Croix de Guerre. Their service became a focal point in later civil rights discussions, illustrating both the contradictions and the possibilities of black citizenship in America. By mid-1918, some 1.3 million American soldiers had crossed the Atlantic in convoys protected by escort ships and destroyers. The U.S. Navy, cooperating with Allied fleets, expanded the convoy system to guard merchantmen against U-boat wolf packs. Destroyer captains, a mix of regular officers and reservists, patrolled relentlessly, depth-charging submarines and rescuing survivors from sunken ships. These efforts gradually reduced Allied shipping losses and ensured a steady flow of troops and supplies to Europe. American forces began arriving at the front in earnest in the spring of 1918. At Cantigny in May, Private Charles Whittlesey led New York National Guardsmen of the 28th Division in the first major American-led offensive, capturing German trenches and holding them against counterattacks. In July at Belleau Wood, Marines of the 2nd Division, supported by Navy machine gun crews, repelled repeated German assaults and brutal forest fighting. Their tenacity earned them the moniker Devil Dogs from German troops who came to fear their ferocity. The decisive moment arrived during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched on September 26. 600,000 American soldiers joined French and British forces in a massive push that aimed to cut off the German supply lines along the Meuse River and rail hub at Sedan. Over 47 days of relentless attack, with tanks, creeping artillery barrages, and coordinated air support, the Allies breached the formidable Hindenburg Line. American divisions captured key villages, cleared minefields under fire, and advanced through dense wire entanglements. The sheer weight of fresh American troops, unbowed by years of stalemate, gave the offensive its momentum. By early November, German morale had collapsed. Mutinies and desertions spread in the Austro-Hungarian and German armies. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. On November 11th, at the 11th hour, an armistice went into effect. Across the front, soldiers laid down their arms, embraced former foes, and wondered how so vast a conflict could end so abruptly. American involvement had turned the tide decisively. In a matter of months, U.S. troops, supplies, and industrial capacity overwhelmed the exhausted Central Powers. More than 2 million Americans served in Europe. 116,000 gave their lives, 204,000 were wounded. Their arrival hastened the end of fighting and established the United States as a great power on the world stage. As I close this chapter of our long chronicle, I feel the weight of what America's entry entailed. A profound shift in the war's scale and character, the mobilization of an entire continent's resources, and the forging of bonds between Americans and Europeans that would endure well beyond the gun's final silence. In our next and final letter, we will turn to the consequences of this great conflict, the peace settlements, the social changes, and the legacies that would shape the decades to come. Until then, may the memory of those who crossed ocean and battlefield for liberty remain ever present in our thoughts. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 13. The End Approaches. My dear friend, I hope this letter finds you in peaceful reflection as we draw near to the final days of the great conflict. In the early months of 1918, the world seemed locked in an unbreakable stalemate. Yet beneath the winter snows and spring showers, the forces that would bring the war to its close were gathering momentum. In this chapter, I wish to guide you through the last offensives, the collapse of empires, and the profound relief that rippled across continents on the morning of November 11th, 1918. As winter gave way to spring in 1918, both sides prepared for what they hoped would be a decisive blow. The German High Command, mindful of dwindling supplies and the arrival of fresh American troops, launched a series of attacks along the Western Front beginning in March. Known as the Ludendorff offensives, these operations struck hardest near the Somme and in the Lys Valley. German stormtroopers, trained to bypass strong points and infiltrate rear positions, advanced quickly at first. Towns that had known little change for years felt the shock of breaching lines once thought secure. Yet the cost of these gains was immense. Each yard forward required fresh waves of men, and every village passed became a tomb of the brave. By mid-spring, the tide of these assaults began to turn. British and French troops, though weary, held firm in trenches newly reinforced with concrete and steel. They learned to lay down overlapping fields of fire and to call in coordinated artillery fire that shattered German columns before they could exploit gaps. American divisions, though green to combat, arrived in increasing numbers and brought new energy to the defense. Their presence bolstered Allied morale and tightened the noose around the exhausted attackers. As summer settled over Europe, the balance shifted decisively. On August 8, 1918, Allied commanders, French Marshal Foch, British General Haig, and American General Pershing launched the 100 Days Offensive. This coordinated push struck along a broad front from Amiens to the Argonne Forest. Tanks advanced behind rolling barrages of artillery that moved forward at a measured pace to keep enemy heads down. Infantry followed at a disciplined walk, filling the space cleared by artillery and climbing out of trenches to press the attack. Wherever the Germans tried to rally, they found themselves outflanked or outgunned. In the south at Amiens, Canadian and Australian forces captured key villages in the first day, calling that 8th day the Black Day of the German Army. British troops rolled forward through fields of ripening grain. French divisions cleared the region around Soissons and Châteauroux. American units in the Argonne Forest fought through tangled undergrowth, clearing bunkers and capturing enemy artillery pieces that had bombarded them for months. Each success led to the next, as the Allied advance turned into a steady push eastward. Back in the capitals, news of these victories spread rapidly. In Paris, crowds cheered in the streets when telegraph wires delivered reports of prisoners taken and guns captured. In London, factory whistles blew at midday in celebration, and public gardens filled with families dancing to military bands. In New York, newspapers printed jubilant headlines declaring that the tide of battle had turned. Posters recruiting more volunteers transformed into posters urging support for disabled veterans and messages of thanksgiving for the armed forces. Meanwhile, the Central Powers found themselves unraveling from within. In the Balkans, Bulgaria sued for peace on September 29th, ending its years of occupation and deserting the war on its southern flank. That collapse exposed the southern border of Austria-Hungary and forced German troops to detach units to guard against further crises. On October 30th, the Ottoman Empire signed the Mudros Armistice, surrendering its fleet and conceding control of the Dardanelles. This loss severed Germany's access to resources in the Near East and deprived its armies of vital lines of communication. Austria-Hungary, a mosaic of peoples already strained by years of hardship and rising nationalist sentiments, began to fracture rapidly. Czech, Slovak, South Slav, and Romanian delegates proclaimed their independence in the final days of October. Emperor Karl issued a proclamation transforming the empire into a federal union, but the gesture came too late to hold the provinces together. By October 31st, the dual monarchy had effectively dissolved as newly declared republics took shape in Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Zagreb. Germany found itself isolated and exhausted. Food shortages in the cities led to strikes and protest demonstrations. Sailors in Kiel mutinied in early November, refusing orders to engage in a final death ride against the British fleet. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed in towns and factories, calling for an end to the monarchy and demanding peace. Kaiser Wilhelm II recognized the tide had turned. On the 9th of November, he abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, leaving his country without a monarch and in the grip of political upheaval. With the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires gone and Bulgaria out of the war, Germany stood alone on the western field. Marshal Foch and his staff drafted terms for an armistice that called for the evacuation of occupied territories and the surrender of heavy weapons. The German government, desperate to stop the Allied advance and fearful of further internal rioting, agreed to the terms. On November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. The moment of silence carried a weight beyond any single battlefield. Soldiers in battered uniforms stood at ease in trenches, their faces turned toward the low winter sun. They lowered their rifles and removed their steel helmets. In villages behind the lines, church bells rang and families gathered around windows. Across France and Belgium, bells tolled in joyful peals. In Germany and Austria, word spread through railway stations and factories. Crowds cheered for the end of fighting, even as they wondered what peace would bring. In London, a great crowd gathered in Hyde Park and cheered as the news was read aloud. In Paris, car horns sounded a spontaneous symphony of triumph. In New York, bells rang at the Wall Street post office, and in small towns across the nation, church steeples rose into the cool autumn sky. American soldiers, still on French soil, removed their gauntlets and embraced French civilians who had endured years of occupation and shelling. Red Cross workers wept with relief that their schedules of endless shipments and makeshift hospitals could at last come to a close. And yet the relief was tempered by sorrow. In towns and cities, crosses and simple wooden markers stood in rows in cemeteries and fields, each one bearing a name carved or painted in haste. Families gathered at home to mourn loved ones who would never return. Communities held memorial services, reading the names of the fallen aloud and placing wreaths of autumn leaves and flowers upon the graves. Mothers dried tears as they pinned sprigs of holly or laurel to black ribbons, the traditional symbol of mourning in many regions. In the armies themselves, officers wrote letters home to report the armistice and to request leave for soldiers who had endured countless battles. Soldiers packed their greatcoats and cleaned their rifles one last time. They wondered how long it would take to return to civilian life after so long in uniform. Some spoke of plans to marry, to study, to take up trades they had left behind. Others feared the challenges of finding work in economies battered by years of war. Governments moved swiftly to negotiate peace treaties. The Allies gathered in Paris the following year to work out terms that would reshape the map of Europe and the Middle East. In October 1918, the Council of Ministers met, and in June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Yet those are matters for our next letter. Tonight, let us remember the moment when the guns fell silent, when soldiers laid down their arms, and when a long winter of fear gave way to hope for a new spring. As I close this letter, I am filled with gratitude for your companionship on this journey through the years of war. May the memory of that November morning remind us always of the human cost of conflict and of the fragile promise of peace that follows its end. Yours ever in friendship. Chapter 14, Peace. Chapter 14, Peace at Last. My dear friend, I hope this letter finds you in gentle repose, for we now approach the moment when the world gathered to transform the silence of guns into the words of treaties. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, brought an end to the fighting, yet it did not bring peace in the fuller sense until months later, in the halls of Versailles and beyond. In this chapter, I wish to walk you through the Paris Peace Conference, the ideals and compromises that shaped its outcome, and the treaties that redrew maps and sowed hopes and grievances across the globe. As winter yielded to spring, delegates from more than 20 victorious and neutral nations assembled in Paris under the banner of the newly formed League of Nations. The Great Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles welcomed heads of state and prime ministers, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, whose differing visions would shape a fragile peace. Smaller nations, too, found voices at the table. Belgium, Serbia, Greece, Brazil, and others seeking reward or recognition. Yet the major decisions lay with the Big Four, whose contrasting priorities soon became evident. President Wilson, buoyed by his 14 points outlined in January 1917, arrived determined to secure lasting peace grounded in self-determination, free trade, and open diplomacy. He envisioned a world in which secret treaties were replaced by transparent agreements, national boundaries respected the will of peoples, and an international body resolved disputes without recourse to war. His proposals included the restoration of Alsace-Lorraine to France, autonomy for Austria-Hungary's peoples, Polish access to the sea, and a general reduction of armaments. He pressed ardently for the League of Nations, whose covenant would bind members to mutual consultation and collective security. By contrast, France's premier, Georges Clemenceau, bore the scars of war on his nation. His fields had been battlegrounds once more, and he sought firm guarantees against future German aggression. He insisted on reparations sufficient to rebuild shattered towns and to weaken Germany's capacity to rearm. He demanded the permanent demilitarization of the Rhineland and control over the Saar coalfields to secure France's industrial future. Clemenceau's guiding motto was "No security, no peace," reflecting his belief that justice required firm boundaries and financial recompense for suffering on French soil. Britain's David Lloyd George occupied a middle ground. He recognized the need for reparations to satisfy public outrage at wartime losses and to offset Britain's own staggering national debt. Yet he feared that crippling Germany would destabilize Europe and hamper trade with a principal partner. He sought modest territorial adjustments, colonial mandates that would expand British influence in the Middle East and Pacific, and provisions to protect maritime commerce. He supported Wilson's League concept in principle, but remained wary of overly broad commitments that might obligate Britain to unwanted conflicts. Italy's Vittorio Orlando arrived with expectations shaped by secret wartime promises made at London in 1915. He pressed for Italian claims to territories along the Adriatic coast, Trentino, South Tyrol, Istria, and Dalmatia, where Italian speakers mingled with Slavic populations. Though Italy had fought alongside the Allies, its gains proved modest compared with its aspirations, fueling Italian resentment when the final treaties fell short. Orlando's disputes with his partners highlighted the tension between ethnic self-determination and the desire of great powers to secure strategic frontiers. Amid these competing aims, the conference unfolded in a series of commissions and plenary sessions. Cartographers labored over maps marking rivers, mountains, and towns, debating where to draw lines that would honor both Wilson's principles and Clemenceau's demands. Legal scholars hunted for precedents in 19th-century treaties, while economists calculated the sums Germany might pay without collapsing into chaos. Military advisors forecast the defenses necessary to maintain stability, though their plans often collided with the idealism of the diplomats. By May of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles lay complete. It imposed upon Germany a war guilt clause assigning responsibility for the conflict, thereby providing legal basis for reparations. Germany accepted liability for civilian damages amounting to $33 billion in gold, a figure destined to strain its economy. Its army was limited to 100,000 volunteers, its navy reduced to a few light vessels, and its air force abolished outright. The Rhineland was to be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years and permanently demilitarized thereafter. The Saar Basin was placed under League administration for 15 years, with its coalfields ceded to France in the interim. At the same time, Germany lost its overseas colonies, which became League mandates entrusted to Britain, France, Belgium, and South Africa. Cameroon and Togoland passed jointly to Britain and France. German East Africa became Tanganyika under British mandate, while Rwanda and Burundi came under Belgian rule. German Southwest Africa became a South African mandate. These arrangements formalized the shift from direct colonial rule to an ideology of stewardship, yet they also entrenched imperial control under new legal forms. While Versailles dominated headlines, other treaties addressed the fates of Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Turks. The Treaty of Saint-Germain in September 1919 dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire, recognizing the independence of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the reborn Republic of Austria. It forbade Anschluss, or union, between Austria and Germany, and it limited Austria's armed forces. The Treaty of Trianon in June 1920 severed Hungary from its former territories, transferring Transylvania to Romania, Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia, and Croatia and Slovenia to Yugoslavia. Hungary found itself reduced to one-third of its former size, fueling revanchism and national trauma. Bulgaria signed the Treaty of Neri in November 1919, ceding territory to Greece, Romania, and the new Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, represented by a rump government in Istanbul, concluded the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920, losing Arab provinces to British and French mandates, ceding Smyrna to Greece, and granting autonomy to Armenia and Kurdistan. Sèvres proved short-lived, overtaken by the Turkish War of Independence, which culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923 and established the modern Republic of Turkey. Beyond territorial adjustments and military restrictions, the peace settlements addressed minorities and economic provisions. New states were required to guarantee civil rights for ethnic and religious minorities. League of Nations mandates were to promote the well-being and development of local populations, though in practice this aim often masked continued imperial control. Economic clauses attempted to restore international trade into free shipping lanes, but they also imposed heavy tax burdens that complicated recovery. Despite Wilson's hopes, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or to join the League of Nations. Partisan debates in Washington focused on fears of entangling alliances and the curtailment of American sovereignty. As a result, America negotiated separate peace treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary in 1921, remaining outside the League it had inspired. This absence weakened the League's authority and foreshadowed future challenges to collective security. The peace conference thus produced a complex legacy. On one hand, it dismantled empires that had dominated Europe for centuries, elevated new nations to statehood, and created institutions aimed at preventing future wars. On the other hand, it left many peoples dissatisfied, Germans humiliated and economically burdened, Italians feeling cheated of promised lands, Slavic minorities caught in new states, and colonized peoples denied full independence. Moreover, the harsh terms imposed on the defeated powers fanned nationalist resentments that would flare again in decades to come. In the months following Versailles, Europe struggled to rebuild. Walls of shattered towns rose anew, railways were repaired, and millions returned from military service to seek work and refuge. Hyperinflation in Germany wiped out savings, while poverty and political extremism found fertile ground in battered societies. In Eastern Europe, ethnic clashes broke out as new borders divided communities, and civil wars raged in Russia between Bolsheviks and their opponents. Yet amid these trials, there were also achievements. International cooperation in health, labor standards, and refugee relief took initial form under League auspices. Women gained political rights in several countries, recognizing their contributions during the war. Scientific and cultural exchanges resumed across borders, knitting together intellectual communities fractured by conflict. As I fold this letter, I am struck by the irony that the peace meant to end all wars ultimately contained the seeds of future strife. The negotiations in Versailles revealed both the power and the limits of diplomacy. They showed that ideals of justice and self-determination could inspire change, yet they also demonstrated how the demands of victor and vanquished must be balanced with care if peace is to endure. In our final letter, we will consider the lasting echoes of this great conflict, how it reshaped societies, economies, and minds, and how its lessons continue to guide or warn us today. Until then, may we hold fast to the hope that understanding our past may help us build a more just and lasting peace. Yours ever in friendship, T. Last. Chapter 15. Echoes Across Time. My dear friend, I write to you now as our journey through the years of conflict draws to its close. We have traced the tender sparks of rivalry, the grinding churn of trench warfare, and the hopeful dawn of armistice. Yet the end of fighting did not mark the end of consequence. The reverberations of the Great War shaped nations, societies, and minds in ways both hopeful and tragic. In this final chapter, I wish to explore the lasting legacies of that conflict, the political upheavals it unleashed, the social changes it wrought, and the threads of grievance and aspiration that would one day lead to another great struggle. The collapse of empires remains one of the most dramatic outcomes of the war. In 1918, the centuries-old dynasties of the Habsburgs and the Ottomans crumbled, swept aside by national movements long restrained by imperial rule. Russia's Romanov dynasty fell in revolution 2 years before the armistice, giving way to a new order under Bolshevik leadership. Germany's Kaiser abdicated, and his empire transformed into a fragile republic. These upheavals reordered the map of Europe and the Near East. New nations rose from old dominions. Poland emerged from partitions as a sovereign state. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania won their independence. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes gathered people of shared culture into new polities. In the Middle East, the Arab lands previously administered by the Ottomans came under French and British mandates. Each new boundary and each sovereign claim carried hopes of self-rule and fears of minority strife. The mixture of triumph and uncertainty defined many people's first steps into the post-war world. These redrawn borders carried profound implications. In Central Europe, Hungary's loss of territory left millions of ethnic Hungarians outside their state. In the Rhineland, French desire for security planted deep resentment in German hearts. The treaty settlements at Versailles, Saint-Germain, Trianon, and Sèvres sought to balance the principle of national self-determination with the strategic aims of the victors. In practice, the results were uneven. Some minorities found new protections under international law. Others discovered that their towns had been ceded to neighboring countries against their preferences. The interwar period saw ethnic clashes in the Balkans, uprisings in border regions of Poland and Czechoslovakia, and tensions in the Sudetenland that would later ignite conflict anew. The lesson remains that borders drawn by diplomats can bring both security and grievance in equal measure. Beyond the map, the war accelerated social changes that had been gathering for decades. Perhaps the most visible of these was the extension of the franchise. Women's contributions at home and near the front shattered arguments that their place lay only in private life. In Britain and Germany, in Austria and Russia, women won the right to vote in the years after the war. In the United States, the 19th Amendment granted women's suffrage in 1920. The shift did not end gender inequality, yet it signaled fundamental change. Alongside political rights came broader social reforms. Labor movements grew stronger as workers insisted that the sacrifices of war entitled them to better wages and conditions. Unemployment benefits, shorter work hours, and old age pensions gained acceptance in new welfare legislation across Europe. The notion that governments bore responsibility for social welfare found its first widespread expression in the war's aftermath. Economically, the war left deep scars. European governments spent far more than they had raised in taxes, borrowing heavily at home and abroad. Germany experienced hyperinflation in the early 20s that wiped out savings and destabilized its middle class. Britain and France faced staggering debts to American banks. Many economies struggled to convert from wartime production to peacetime industry. Unemployment rose as soldiers returned to a job market already strained. The disruption of trade, blockades, and the redrawing of colonial relationships altered patterns of commerce. These economic strains contributed to the Great Depression at the end of the decade. The specter of mass poverty and social unrest loomed over many societies, urging governments to seek new forms of economic cooperation and regulation. Cultural life, too, bore the imprint of war. In the arts, movements like Dada and Surrealism rejected conventional aesthetics, reflecting disillusionment with the rational world that had unleashed such devastation. Writers from Wilfred Owen to Eric Maria Remarque captured the bleakness of life in the trenches and the loss of innocence that followed. Music and painting explored new forms of expression, seeking to convey the fractured psyche of a generation battered by mechanized slaughter. At the same time, the practice of memorializing the dead became universal. Stone monuments rose in village squares and city parks bearing the names of the fallen. Ceremonies on anniversaries fostered a collective remembrance that honored sacrifice, even as it mourned the carnage. In these rituals, communities found both unity and grief. The psychological effects of modern combat also spurred new understanding of the human mind. The term shell shock entered common use to describe the traumatic symptoms experienced by survivors of bombardment and combat. Psychiatrists and neurologists studied these cases, laying early groundwork for the field of clinical psychology. Treatments ranged from rest cures in secluded hospitals to the first experiments in psychotherapy. The awareness that war left invisible wounds alongside physical injuries reshaped attitudes toward mental health and inspired compassionate approaches to care that would evolve over the 20th century. Technological and medical advances emerged from the crucible of necessity. Blood transfusion techniques improved under pre-war experimentation and wartime urgency, saving countless lives. Plastic surgery and reconstructive techniques advanced rapidly as surgeons addressed facial and limb injuries. The development of mobile X-ray units and antiseptics reduced mortality from wounds and disease. Innovations in radio communications, lip-smokeless powder, tanks, and aircraft changed the nature of warfare and found later applications in civilian life. The interplay of ingenuity and tragedy revealed how crisis accelerated the pace of scientific progress. On the diplomatic front, the war brought forth the first experiment in collective security through the League of Nations. Born from President Wilson's vision but weakened by the absence of the United States, the League sought to mediate conflicts, supervise disarmament, and administer mandates. It intervened in disputes from the Russo-Polish War to the Greco-Turkish conflict and organized relief for refugees of the Russian Civil War and the Armenian Genocide. Though ultimately unable to prevent aggression by Italy in Ethiopia or Japan in Manchuria, the League established precedents for international cooperation and arbitration that would inform the later United Nations. Yet the very grievances left by peace treaties and the economic scars of the 20s stoked the flames of revisionism. In Germany, the narrative of the stab in the back blamed politicians and minorities for defeat and inspired radical nationalist movements. In Italy, the perceived mutilated victory fed resentment against the Allies. In Japan, dissatisfaction with colonial mandates and racial discrimination at power conferences grew in nationalist circles. In the Soviet Union, the promise of workers' revolution led to the aggressive export of Bolshevism. These ideological tensions, nurtured by economic hardship and lessons of power politics, paved the way for the rise of dictatorships and the outbreak of another global conflict 2 decades later. The war also reshaped colonial relationships. European powers, weakened by the conflict, found it harder to maintain direct control over distant territories. Nationalist movements in India, Egypt, and elsewhere appealed to principles of self-determination articulated by Wilson. In some colonies, reforms offered limited self-rule, yet full independence remained distant. The seeds of decolonization were sown in veterans' associations and wartime promises. Soldiers who fought for imperial powers returned with new expectations. In Africa and Asia, the idea of modern citizenship, once alien to colonial subjects, took root and would grow into full independence movements after the Second World War. In the Americas, the war elevated the United States to new prominence in global affairs. Its economic and military contributions tipped the balance in 1918. American banks, goods, and expertise shaped Reconstruction efforts. The dollar supplanted sterling as a leading reserve currency. Politically, though isolationist currents reemerged in Congress, the idea that the United States could influence international order took firm hold. The debates over the League and over America's role in collective security would echo through the interwar years and define the country's foreign policy in the decades ahead. Meanwhile, the concept of total war, which encompassed both combatants and civilians, influenced social and political thought. Governments became accustomed to shaping public opinion through propaganda and state control of industry. The wartime expansions of state authority persisted in peacetime legislation regulating commerce, labor, and social welfare. The boundaries between civilian governance and military planning blurred, raising enduring questions about the balance between security and liberty in democratic societies. In the realm of memory, the Great War took on a mythic dimension. Writers and poets created narratives that elevated sacrifice and valor. Schools taught the history of the conflict as a moral lesson. Veterans associations formed rituals of remembrance and advocacy for pensions and care. Monuments became sites of pilgrimage where families sought solace and sought meaning in loss. Across cultures, the phrase "lest we forget" captured a shared determination to remember the horrors of war and to strive for a lasting peace. As our correspondence draws to its close, I reflect on how the echoes of the Great War shaped the world we now inhabit. The conflict unleashed forces of nationalism and revolution, of social reform and artistic innovation, of international cooperation and bitter grievance. Its legacy reminds us that the cost of war transcends immediate destruction. It leaves wounds in economies, minds, and hearts that can endure for generations. Yet it also teaches us that human resilience, compassion, and creativity can emerge from the darkest times. May these reflections guide us to cherish peace and to pursue justice with humility and resolve. May we honor the memory of those who fell by working tirelessly to address the causes of conflict and to heal the divisions among peoples. And may the lessons of that distant war inspire us to build a more secure and compassionate world for the generations to come. Yours ever in friendship.